Thanks for joining. Find your most relaxing position, take a slow breath in, and let's begin our very quiet stroll through history. And if you feel like these videos are of any use to you, then you can like and subscribe, but only if you really feel like it. And now, let's begin. As the first rays of the sun reluctantly crawl their way into your medieval tent, the reality of your soldier's life hits you like a poorly aimed mace. You blink away the sleep, your breath visible in the icy air, and wonder why the troubadours never composed ballads about waking up shivering in a canvas cocoon. Sure, they sang about knights in shining armour and damsels in distress, but where's the verse about shivering in a tent that smells like old straw and too many unwashed bodies? Ah, the romance of medieval warfare. Let's talk about that tent. Forget those modern pop-up contraptions you see at music festivals. The medieval version is more a testament to practicality than comfort. You're likely lying beneath a canopy of wool or linen, depending on your rank and your army's budget. Linen was the cheaper option, but wool? Now that's the medieval equivalent of splurging on Egyptian cotton sheets. These materials were sturdy, weather-resistant and, most importantly, light enough to be carried by a soldier who already had enough on his plate, or rather in his backpack. Now, you might be picturing a big, sprawling tent, the kind that could host a small feast. Sorry to disappoint, but unless you're a commander or a noble, your tent is more like a canvas burrito for one, or two, if you're lucky enough to have a tent mate who doesn't snore like a warhorse. The average soldier's tent was a modest affair, perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet, just enough space to curl up and question your life choices. The real genius, though, came in how soldiers kept these makeshift homes warm. Into the night in shining practicality, the brazier. Imagine a small portable fire pit, typically made of clay or metal. You'd fill it with charcoal or wood, light it up, and presto, you've got a mini furnace to fend off frostbite. Of course, there was always the risk of setting yourself or your tent on fire, but hey, no one ever said medieval life was without its hazards. But here's the kicker. Despite the brazier's warmth, medieval soldiers often slept in their armour. I know. It sounds like the medieval version of sleeping in a suit of tinfoil. Yet, when the enemy is just beyond the next hill, and the threat of a dawn raid looms, keeping your armour on seems like a smart, albeit uncomfortable, compromise. It's not like there were pyjamas in the 14th century catalogue anyway. Now, let's dispel the myth that medieval soldiers were all about chivalry and gallantry. Hollywood has done a bang-up job convincing us that knights were these noble warriors, all about honour and maiden saving. The truth? Most soldiers were everyday folks, conscripted peasants who'd traded ploughs for pikes. Their days revolved around survival, not serenades. Forget about gallantry, it was more about getting enough food, avoiding dysentery, and not dying of hypothermia. Romantic, right? Then there's the camaraderie, or lack thereof. Sleeping next to your fellow soldiers could be a bonding experience, but more often it was about tolerating the snoring, the occasional bout of medieval flatulence, and the shared misery of waking up to yet another day of marching and fighting. The company was small comfort when you were all equally cold and equally tired. If we dive into the numbers, the composition of these armies was as varied as a medieval banquet. A standard company might consist of about 100 men, with a mix of archers, infantry, and cavalry. Each of these soldiers had their own tent, their own brazier, and their own unique brand of morning grumpiness. The tents were arranged in neat rows, a temporary village of canvas and wool, each one a tiny fortress against the elements. So here you are, a medieval soldier, lying in your tent as the sun rises. You're wrapped in a cloak, curled up on a straw mattress that's more lumps than comfort, and clutching your sword like a teddy bear. The brazier still glows faintly, a reminder of last night's fire, and you take a moment to appreciate its warmth before the day's chaos begins. This is your morning routine, less about heraldry and more about huddling for heat. Welcome to the unromantic, gritty reality of medieval soldiering. And as you reluctantly roll out of your straw haven, blinking away the last vestiges of sleep, you're thrust into the organized chaos that is a medieval army camp. Picture a bustling scene, almost like a pop-up medieval village, but with more swords and considerably less hygiene. Welcome to the midday hustle, where the true unromantic nature of medieval warfare reveals itself, not in glory and gallantry, but in grit and graft. Now, here's what they don't tell you in those history books filled with pictures of knights and castles. Medieval soldiers were the original multitaskers. When they weren't on the battlefield, they were busy being blacksmiths, cobblers, hunters, and even cooks. Yes, you heard that right. Not only did they have to wield a sword, but they also had to wield a ladle. You see, feeding an army wasn't just about hitting up the medieval equivalent of a drive-through. It was a logistical nightmare that would make even the most seasoned quartermaster break into a cold sweat. Imagine coordinating the daily meals for thousands of men. We're talking 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers on the move in a large army. That's a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of food to forage, pilfer, or buy. And it wasn't just about getting enough food, it was about keeping it from spoiling. Salted meat and hardtack were staples, not because they were delicious, but because they could survive the journey. Think of hardtack as the medieval power bar, only a bit less chewy and more like gnawing on a piece of wood. Then there's the matter of the supply chain. Forget Amazon Prime, getting supplies to a moving army was a Herculean task. The supply trains, often stretching miles, were like the lifeblood of the army, carrying everything from food to weapons to medical supplies. A typical supply train could include hundreds of wagons and thousands of pack animals. Each wagon was a testament to medieval ingenuity, creaking under the weight of barrels of ale, sacks of grain, and the all-important barrels of salt. No wonder logistics officers were often unsung heroes. Keeping everyone fed and fighting was as crucial as the battles themselves. But logistics wasn't just about the stuff you could carry. Enter the camp followers, the unsung lifeblood of the medieval army. These were the folks who followed the army from battlefield to battlefield, providing crucial support services. We're talking cooks, laundresses, blacksmiths, and even the occasional medic, because yes, someone had to patch up those sword wounds. They were often women, children, and older men who couldn't fight, but still played a vital role. And while they may not have written ballads about them, these followers were the backbone of the army's day-to-day operations. Camp followers also added a touch of normalcy to the soldiers' lives, bringing with them a sense of family and community amid the chaos. They managed to create small havens of domesticity, complete with makeshift kitchens and laundry lines fluttering in the breeze like medieval bunting. Their presence wasn't just practical, it was a psychological balm, a reminder of home and a life marked by uncertainty. But don't get too misty-eyed about the charming picture of camp followers. It wasn't all homemade bread and warm woolen socks. These folks faced their own dangers, from the threat of enemy raids to the very real possibility of disease sweeping through the camp. If you think medieval warfare was romantic, try dealing with an outbreak of dysentery while still keeping the soup pot bubbling. And speaking of disease, let's talk hygiene, or the lack thereof. Medieval camps weren't exactly known for their cleanliness. With thousands of men living cheek by jowl, sanitation was an afterthought. Latrines were often just shallow trenches, and washing facilities were rudimentary at best. It's no wonder that illness could spread faster than rumours of free ale. Now, let's tackle another romanticized notion, the idea that medieval armies were well equipped, gleaming with polished armour and sharpened swords. In reality, the average soldier's gear was a hodgepodge of hand-me-downs, battlefield scavenging, and whatever could be bartered for or stolen. While a knight might have a custom-fitted suit of armour, the average foot soldier made do with whatever fit well enough not to fall off mid-charge. Equipping an army was an expensive business, often straining the coffers of even the wealthiest kingdoms. A suit of armour could cost the equivalent of a small fortune, easily out of reach for the humble conscript. Instead, many soldiers wore padded jackets known as gambesons, which, while not exactly bulletproof, offered some protection against arrows and sword blows. And if you were really lucky, you might have a helmet to keep your brains where they belonged. In this midday medley of chaos, you'd find soldiers sharpening weapons, mending armour, and repairing gear. Blacksmiths were hard at work, hammering out dents and forging new arrowheads. Beside them, cobblers toiled away, patching up boots that had seen more miles than most medieval peasants travelled in a lifetime. It was a scene of industriousness that would warm the heart of any efficiency expert, if efficiency experts existed in the Middle Ages. So, as you navigate this medieval marketplace of military might, remember that it's not just about the battles fought. It's about the battles behind the battles, the logistical, economic, and human struggles that kept the army moving forward. And as you glance at the camp followers tending to their duties, the soldiers juggling tasks like a medieval circus act, and the endless supply wagons rolling by, you realize that this is the true heart of medieval warfare. An army not just of soldiers, but of survivors, hustling their way through history, one muddy step at a time. As the dust from the supply wagon settles, you find yourself stepping into the intricate social tapestry of a medieval military camp, where hierarchy is as visible as the mud on your boots. In this bustling microcosm, roles and ranks are as clearly defined as the lines in a knight's coat of arms. At the top of the food chain, you've got the commanders, the big kahunas who make the strategic decisions from the warmth of their decently sized tents. Think of them as the medieval CEOs, minus the corner office and with a lot more chainmail. These commanders, often noblemen, had tents that were not just bigger, but also better furnished. We're talking about items like wooden beds, chairs, and perhaps even a table for planning battles, a far cry from the straw-stuffed sack you call a mattress. Their tents were the nerve centres of the camp, where decisions were made over maps and mugs of ale. And don't think for a second that these meetings were all about military tactics. Political intrigues were as much a part of the agenda as deciding who would take the left flank in tomorrow's skirmish. Beneath the commanders, you have your knights and lesser nobles, the middle management of the medieval army. These guys were the ones who had to balance the orders from above with the grumbles from the ranks below. Knights often shared tents with their squires, who were essentially the medieval version of personal assistants, tasked with duties from polishing armor to running errands. The squires learned the ropes, hoping one day to move up in the world, if they survived the battlefield, that is. Now, let's zoom in on the everyday soldiers, the real backbone of the army. These were the foot soldiers, archers, and pikemen, the ones who did the heavy lifting and the heavy fighting. Their tents were smaller, their equipment simpler, and their life considerably more rugged. The social dynamics here were less about politics and more about survival, camaraderie, and the occasional squabble over who ate the last piece of hardtack. And speaking of camaraderie, let's dispel another myth. The idea that medieval armies were all about brotherhood and shared purpose. Sure, there was camaraderie, nothing like a good skirmish to forge bonds, but there was also tension. With thousands of men cramped together, tempers could flare faster than a torch in a hay barn. Arguments over rations, duties, and even sleeping arrangements were common, and settling disputes often required the intervention of a sergeant or a knight. Think of them as the HR department, but with more armor and fewer meetings. The sergeants themselves were a fascinating group, often veteran soldiers who had seen more battles than they cared to count. They were the glue holding the ranks together, mediating disputes, doling out chores, and making sure everyone was battle-ready. They were also the ones who knew the men by name, their strengths and weaknesses, and could whip a ragtag group into a disciplined unit. Their authority came from experience, not rank. Soldiers respected them not because they had to, but because they wanted to. But let's not forget the political maneuvers happening behind the scenes. Alliances and rivalries weren't limited to the battlefields. They played out within the camp as well. Nobles vied for influence, forming alliances with fellow commanders or even the royals leading the campaign. These alliances could influence everything from the distribution of supplies to the assignment of strategic positions. It was like a medieval game of chess, where every move could have far-reaching consequences. Rumours of treachery and betrayal weren't uncommon either. Spies were a constant threat, and trust was a rare commodity. Commanders had to be wary of leaks, as information was a powerful weapon. A single misplaced word could lead to a strategic blunder, or worse, a defeat. This was where the political savvy of a commander came into play, balancing trust and suspicion like a tightrope walker juggling flaming swords. Economic context played a significant role too. Armies were expensive to maintain, and the financial burden often fell on the shoulders of the nobility funding the campaign. Soldiers needed to be paid, fed, and equipped, and this required a steady flow of money. The promise of loot and plunder was often a motivating factor for soldiers, but the harsh reality was that many campaigns ended with little to show for their efforts. It was a gamble, where the stakes were high and the rewards uncertain. Despite these challenges, the camp remained a hub of activity where roles, ranks, and relationships intertwined to form a complex web. It was a place where camaraderie and tension coexisted, where political intrigues buzzed like flies around a feast, and where the social dynamics were as unpredictable as the weather. It was a world where the line between friend and foe could blur, where trust was hard won, and where every day was a new battle, both on and off the field. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp, you couldn't help but marvel at the sheer resilience of these medieval soldiers. They were more than just warriors. They were survivors, navigating the intricate dance of hierarchy and politics with the same skill they wielded their weapons. And as you watched them go about their duties, you realized that this was the true heart of the medieval army. A tapestry of human ambition, struggle, and perseverance woven together by the threads of history. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting its final amber glow across the camp, the medieval soldiers prepare for another cold night that promises to be as unforgiving as a tax collector on payday. With the day's hustle and bustle behind them, thoughts turn to the pressing issue of not freezing their chainmail off, because let's face it, medieval nights aren't exactly known for their toasty warmth. Now, let's talk about layering. In the modern world, we have things like thermal underwear and heated blankets. Back then, not so much. Soldiers had to get creative. The first layer of defense against the cold was, unsurprisingly, more clothes. They'd pile on whatever they had, tunics, cloaks, spare shirts. If it could be worn, it was worn. Picture a medieval soldier waddling around camp looking like he's auditioning for a role as the world's most underfunded snowman. Fashionable? Maybe not. Effective? Absolutely. And speaking of layering, let's not forget the importance of wool. This miracle material was the medieval equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. Versatile, durable, and thanks to its insulating properties, the closest thing they had to central heating. A good woolen cloak was worth its weight in gold, or at least in whatever currency they were using at the time. Soldiers who could afford one would wrap themselves up like overstuffed burritos, hoping to trap every last bit of body heat. Now, on to bedding. A soldier's mattress was typically a sack stuffed with straw, which sounds about as comfortable as sleeping on a pile of porcupines. But necessity is the mother of invention, and medieval soldiers were nothing if not resourceful. They'd fluff up their straw to create a semblance of cushioning and, when possible, add a layer of furs for extra insulation. Furs were the medieval version of a weighted blanket, offering warmth and a touch of luxury that was otherwise in short supply. But here's the thing about furs. They were expensive. Only the luckiest or richest soldiers had access to them. For the rest, it was a game of barter and trade, trying to snag a pelt or two from a passing merchant or a fallen comrade. Hey, waste not, want not. A good fur could mean the difference between a tolerable night and waking up feeling like a medieval popsicle. And then there's the communal aspect of warmth. Remember the buddy system from school field trips? Well, it turns out that it was alive and well in the medieval army camp, only this time it was more about survival than supervision. Soldiers would huddle together in their tents, sharing body heat like a group of shivering penguins. It was a practical arrangement, if not exactly a personal space-friendly one. But when temperatures plummeted, modesty went out the tent flap and proximity became a lifesaver. The brazier played its part again, providing a small, flickering oasis of warmth in an otherwise chilly tent. Managed carefully to avoid becoming an accidental bonfire, it was a vital part of the evening routine. Soldiers would hunch over it, hands outstretched to soak up the heat, their faces lit by the glow of the coals. It was the medieval equivalent of gathering around a campfire minus the s'mores and ghost stories. In these moments, the romanticized image of the gallant medieval soldier begins to crumble like a poorly constructed castle wall. The reality was far grittier, filled with the mundane struggle for warmth and the shared discomfort of life on campaign. Despite the ballads and tales of valor, the truth was that many nights were spent not in glorious reflection, but in a desperate bid to stave off hypothermia. The camaraderie born of shared hardship was real, though. As soldiers swapped stories and gripes about the cold, they forged bonds as strong as any forged in battle. These moments of connection were a vital counterpoint to the isolation of life on campaign, reminding them that they were part of something larger, a brotherhood of sorts, forged in fire and frost. As the night wore on and the camp settled into a hushed stillness, the soldiers lay in their tents, cocooned in layers and huddled together like sardines in a tin. The braziers glowed dim to a soft ember, casting shadows that danced across the canvas walls. Outside, the world was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. In this quiet, it was easy to forget the romance of medieval warfare and instead recognize the sheer endurance required to survive it. The soldiers were not knights in shining armor, but ordinary men doing their best to make it through another night, battling not just the enemy, but the elements themselves. And as they drifted off to sleep, their breaths mingling in the cold air, they were united by a simple, unromantic truth. History is not just made in the heat of battle, but also in the quiet struggle for warmth and survival. The legends may tell of glory and honor, but the reality? It was all about making it to morning without turning into a human icicle. So, as these soldiers dreamed of warmer days and better beds, they unknowingly contributed to the tapestry of history. Not as romantic heroes, but as resilient survivors, reminding us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, cold moments in between. So, as these soldiers dreamed of warmer days and better beds, they unknowingly contributed to the tapestry of history, not as romantic heroes, but as resilient survivors, reminding us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, cold moments in between. And it's this resilience, this tenacity to make it through the night, that really deserves a standing ovation. Honestly, if we're handing out trophies for most likely to survive against the odds, medieval soldiers should be polishing their armor and preparing acceptance speeches. But let's zoom out a bit and take in the full picture of what these everyday warriors accomplished. Here's the thing. In a world where most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born, these soldiers trekked hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. They crossed mountains, forded rivers, and navigated forests that made the Black Forest look like a suburban park. This wasn't just a summer camping trip gone wrong, it was an epic journey of survival. Think of them as the original road warriors, only without the reassuring presence of a GPS or a roadside diner serving lukewarm coffee. And what about their skills? Forget about the Hollywood fantasy of bumbling peasants accidentally swinging swords like toddlers with baseball bats. These soldiers spent years honing their craft. They could wield pikes with precision, string a longbow faster than you can say archery tournament, and hold a shield wall that could stop a herd of charging bulls. In fact, a well-trained longbowman could fire 12 arrows per minute, sending those feathered missiles hurtling through the air with lethal force. That's right, these guys were the medieval equivalent of snipers with a range of up to 250 yards. Then there's the adaptability factor. In a world where today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, these soldiers had to be as flexible as a contortionist in a yoga class. 1 minute, they'd be fighting alongside the French, the next, they'd be trading blows with them. Loyalty was as much a commodity as any weapon, and soldiers learned to navigate the shifting sands of medieval politics with the skill of seasoned diplomats. Call them the original spin doctors, if you will. Economically, medieval soldiers were part of a massive machine that fueled entire industries. Armourers, blacksmiths and tailors thrived on the demand for chainmail, swords, and those iconic helmets that doubled as medieval fashion statements. A single suit of armour could cost upwards of £40 sterling, enough to buy several cows or cover a year's rent for a modest estate. And let's not overlook the trade networks that sprang up to feed and supply these armies, stretching from the vineyards of Bordeaux to the wool markets of Flanders. These soldiers weren't just fighting for kings and countries, they were the cogs in an economic engine that drove trade and innovation. But let's get back to the myth busting, because who doesn't love a good reality check? The Middle Ages have been painted with a brush of romance and chivalry, but the truth is grittier than a sandpaper sandwich. Knights didn't spend all their time rescuing damsels and dueling for honour. They were just as likely to be found negotiating peace treaties or managing estates. The average foot soldier wasn't dreaming of glory and fame, he was more concerned with the next meal and the next battle. Life was less about shiny armour and more about survival, one muddy step at a time. Yet, despite the hardships and the harsh realities, medieval soldiers left a legacy that stretches far beyond the battlefield. Their stories, etched into tapestries, chronicled in dusty manuscripts, and passed down through generations, remind us of the enduring human spirit. They were a testament to resourcefulness, a living example of making do with what you have, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who simply endure. And as we look back through the lens of time, it's clear that the real romance of the Middle Ages lies not in the fantasy of noble knights and fair maidens, but in the raw determination of these soldiers to face each day with courage, grit, and a touch of humour. They didn't just survive, they thrived, leaving behind a world forever changed by their resilience and adaptability. So the next time you picture a medieval knight, imagine him not as a Hollywood hero, but as a real person, grubby, tired, but unyielding. Because in the end, it wasn't the armour or the sword that defined these soldiers, it was their unwavering spirit, the very essence of what it means to be human. And that, my friend, is a story worth remembering, even as the final embers of the brazier fade into the night. If Johann Sebastian Bach had been born today, he'd probably be that kid in your class who always had sheet music sticking out of his backpack and whose family reunions required an orchestra pit. In Eisenach, Germany, back in 1685, Bach entered a world where music wasn't just a hobby, it was the family business. The Bach clan was basically the Kardashians of the Baroque era, minus the reality TV, but with a lot more counterpoint. In Eisenach, a quaint town with a population hovering around 3,000, music wasn't just background noise, it was the soundtrack to everyday life. This was a place where even the baker might hum a tune while kneading dough. But for the Bachs, music was more than a pleasant diversion. It was the family trade, passed down like a particularly valuable heirloom, or maybe a slightly malfunctioning but beloved family recipe. You see, young Johann was the 8th child of Johann Ambrosius Bach, a court trumpeter who probably never needed to remind his son to practice his scales. But let's not romanticize it too much. The life of a musician in the late 17th century was less about glory and more about grinding it out for the next paycheck. Musicians were essentially the gig workers of their time, hustling from one patron's favour to the next. Forget the image of the tortured genius composing in a candlelit room. Think more along the lines of a guy trying to make sure his family had enough schnitzel on the table. Speaking of hustle, young Bach was no stranger to schoolboy antics. Legend has it that he once got into hot water for carving a crude drawing of his music teacher into a school desk. Not exactly the behaviour you'd expect from a future musical genius, but hey, not all prodigies are prim and proper. This little escapade gives us a glimpse into the mischievous side of Bach, suggesting that even the most serious composers had their rebellious moments. But let's talk Turkey, or rather, thalers. In the world of 17th century musicians, money was always a pressing concern. The average annual income for musicians was around 20 to 30 thalers, and that wasn't exactly making it rain. For comparison, a skilled craftsman could earn about 100 thalers in the same period. It was a financial juggling act, balancing between paying the rent and keeping the creative juices flowing. For many, composing wasn't a path to riches. It was more like an elaborate way of ensuring you could afford your next meal. To make ends meet, musicians had to wear many hats. They weren't just composers, they were performers, teachers, and sometimes even instrument repairers. And don't forget the church gigs. Being a cantor at a local church was a steady, albeit modest, paycheck. Plus, it came with the bonus of eternal salvation, or at least a good seat in the afterlife. Despite financial pressures, Bach's early years in Eisenach were steeped in melody. The local St. George's Church, where he later played the organ, was practically a second home. Here, Johann absorbed the sounds of choirs and organ music like a sponge, setting the stage for his own compositions. But even as he honed his craft, Bach's path was never smooth. When he was just 10, both his parents died, leaving him an orphan. Talk about a major plot twist no one saw coming. Taken in by his older brother Johann Christoph in Ohrdruf, Bach continued his education and musical training. But don't think for a second that this was some idyllic coming-of-age story. Life with Johann Christoph was more like a boot camp for budding composers. The elder Bach was a strict mentor, and young Johann's musical diet included heavy doses of organ works and sacred music. It was rigorous, but it worked. By the age of 15, Bach was already making a name for himself as a talented organist and composer. Here's the thing, the Bach family wasn't just a group of musicians, they were a dynasty. For over 200 years, the name Bach was synonymous with music across central Germany. They were like the musical equivalent of a medieval guild, complete with their own set of rules, rituals, and a healthy dose of rivalry. Sure, they might have had a few family feuds along the way, who doesn't? But they were united by their passion for music. Despite the hardships, Bach's early life in Eisenach laid the foundation for his future success. It was a world where talent had to be matched with tenacity, where the allure of music was tempered by the grind of reality. Being a composer wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about finding joy in the art itself, even when the rent was due and the pantry was empty. So, the next time you hear a Bach fugue, remember that behind every note was a man who knew the struggle, who carved his path with both mischief and mastery. Bach wasn't just a musical genius, he was a survivor of his times, and his legacy is as much about his melodies as it is about his determination to keep playing, no matter what life threw his way. Fast forward a bit, and we find Johann Sebastian Bach in Arnstadt, a small town that was more of a stepping stone than a final destination on his career ladder. In 1703, at the tender age of 18, Bach landed his first significant gig as an organist at the new church. Now, don't let the title organist mislead you into thinking he was living the high life. The reality? It was more like the musical equivalent of a starter job at a fast food joint, minus the free fries. His pay was around 85 gulden a year, not exactly living it up like a 17th century superstar. To give you some perspective, that was barely enough to keep the candles lit and the sheet music stocked. Arnstadt itself was a town that could be described as cozy, or more accurately, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Bach's job was to get the musical juices flowing at church services, which sounds straightforward until you realize that church choirs back then weren't exactly the Vienna Boys Choir. These were local amateurs who sometimes sang like they were auditioning for a comedy hour. Bach, with his unyielding standards, found himself in a near-constant battle trying to whip these singers into shape. Imagine trying to conduct a choir that occasionally preferred a good ale over perfect pitch. It's no wonder Bach was often frustrated. But what really shook things up in Arnstadt was Bach's infamous incident with a certain bassoonist. Here's the plot twist. Bach got into an actual sword fight with Geyersbach, a student who reportedly wielded a bassoon like it was an extension of his body. Not exactly the kind of skirmish you'd find in a Jane Austen novel, right? This duel wasn't the result of a lover's quarrel or a high-stakes gamble, but rather Bach's sharp tongue and Geyersbach's sore ego. The bassoonist didn't take kindly to Bach's critique of his playing, and before you knew it, swords were drawn. Fortunately, nobody was skewered, but the incident did earn Bach a reprimand from the church council. It wasn't exactly a highlight on his CV, but it did add a certain rock star flair to his resume. Despite the drama, Bach's time in Arnstadt was crucial. It gave him the space to experiment with compositions and refine his craft. However, the town council was less than thrilled with his frequent absences. Like that time he ghosted them for 4 months to go hear the great organist Dietrich Buxtehude in Lübeck. Buxtehude was the rock star of his day, and Bach, ever the music nerd, walked 250 miles just to hear him play. Talk about dedication. But when Bach returned, the council wasn't exactly handing out welcome-back gifts. They raised a stink about his prolonged leave, not to mention the fact that he'd come back with a few newfangled ideas for church music that they considered a bit too avant-garde. On to Mühlhausen in 1707, where Bach found himself in a slightly better situation, or so he thought. Here, Bach snagged a position as the organist at St. Blasius Church. The gig came with a pay bump to 85 gulden, plus a bunch of grain and firewood. Consider it a 17th century benefits package. But the church politics? Oh boy, they were a minefield. Bach quickly learned that working in Mühlhausen meant navigating a labyrinth of town council squabbles and theological debates. Imagine trying to keep everyone happy in a place where even the hymns were a matter of heated discussion. One of Bach's major projects here was composing the Gott ist mein König cantata, performed at the inauguration of the new council in 1708. Yet, despite the music's success, Bach was already feeling the itch to move on. You see, Mühlhausen, while a step up from Arnstadt, was still not the musical mecca he craved. Plus, the constant bickering among church officials was getting old fast. It wasn't long before Bach was once again on the hunt for greener pastures. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Bach wasn't just some musical vagabond chasing after the next gig. He was strategic, always looking for opportunities that would allow him to expand his musical horizons. He wasn't just after a paycheck, he was after a canvas large enough to hold his ambitious compositions. You could say he was like a painter stuck with a postage stamp when he needed a mural. And so, with his sights set on bigger opportunities, Bach bid farewell to Mühlhausen, leaving behind a legacy that was as much about his music as it was about his persistence in the face of adversity. These early chapters in Bach's life were anything but glamorous. They were filled with financial struggles, professional conflicts, and the occasional sword duel. Yet, they shaped him into the composer who would eventually redefine music. It wasn't just about the notes he wrote, but the resilience he showed in a world that wasn't always ready for his genius. So, the next time you're enjoying one of Bach's compositions, remember that behind the intricate harmonies was a man who knew how to fight. Not just with a bassoonist, but with the very limitations of his time. And so, Bach found himself trading the labyrinthine politics of Mühlhausen for the bustling court life in Weimar. It was 1708, and Johann Sebastian was ready to make his mark as a court musician. Picture this. Weimar, a small but influential duchy with a population hovering around 5,000, was a place where the court's pomp and circumstance could rival even the grandest of Renaissance fairs. Bach was recruited by Duke Wilhelm Ernst, a man who understood the value of a good fugue and had no qualms about paying for it. Bach's salary was 150 thalers a year. Now, compared to his previous gigs, this was practically rolling in dough, Baroque style. But don't let the pay raise fool you into thinking Bach was living a rock-star lifestyle. His job was as multifaceted as a Baroque mirror. He was the Concertmeister, responsible for leading the court orchestra and composing new pieces, and he also had church duties. It was the 18th century version of holding multiple side hustles to make ends meet. The Duke, perhaps channeling his inner Simon Cowell, demanded fresh compositions every month. For Bach, this was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, he had the freedom to experiment. On the other, the pressure to produce was relentless. Let's talk about the infamous prison stint, a chapter in Bach's life that's often romanticized as the ultimate bad boy period. In 1717, after 9 years in Weimar, Bach decided it was time to pack his bags for a more prestigious position in Cöthen. Duke Wilhelm Ernst, however, was less than thrilled about losing his star musician. Cue the melodrama. When Bach asked to leave, the Duke responded not with farewell banquets, but with a trip to the clink. That's right, Bach was jailed for nearly a month, not for any wild antics, but simply for trying to quit his job. Talk about a hostile work environment. The myth of Bach, the rebel in prison, is tantalizing, but the truth is far more mundane. It was an office politics showdown, 18th century style. While Bach's stint in Weimar is often overshadowed by his later achievements, it was here that he composed some of his most enduring works, including the Weimar cantatas. These compositions were more than just musical notes. They were a manifestation of Bach's ability to blend the sacred with the secular, the complex with the accessible. The cantatas were written for the church, but had all the grandeur of court music. It was like sneaking a gourmet meal into a potluck. Bach was raising the bar, whether people were ready for it or not. Meanwhile, the court of Weimar was a hotbed of intrigue, with factions vying for influence and favor. Bach had to navigate a political minefield that could rival any modern-day workplace drama. The Duke wasn't the only player in town. His nephew, Ernst August, co-ruled and brought his own set of expectations and demands. Bach's musical duties often meant he had to mediate between these two competing visions. It was like being a musical diplomat, except instead of treaties, you were negotiating over arias. Economically, Weimar was a microcosm of the shifting sands of early 18th century Europe. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended in 1714, and the ripples were felt across the continent. The court, with its reliance on agriculture and trade, had to balance its books carefully. Music, as always, was both a symbol of prestige and a tool for political maneuvering. Bach's compositions weren't just art, they were a form of currency, a way for the Duke to flex his cultural muscles. During his Weimar years, Bach also faced personal challenges. He and his wife, Maria Barbara, were raising a growing family. The Bachs had 6 children during this period, though only 3 survived past infancy, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of the time. Child mortality rates were high, even for someone like Bach, who had a relatively stable income. It was a world where every birth was a roll of the dice, and every family knew the pain of loss. Yet this didn't stop Bach from pouring his soul into his music, perhaps as a way to process the joy and sorrow of his personal life. Now, if you think that Bach's life in Weimar was all work and no play, think again. He was known for his sharp wit and could hold his own in any intellectual debate at court. Music was not just his profession but his passion, and he was constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible. His compositions from this time, though often overshadowed by his later works, show a composer at the height of his powers, unafraid to experiment with form and structure. In many ways, Weimar was the crucible that forged Bach's genius. It was a place where he could hone his craft, test his limits, and prepare for the next chapter of his life. The pressures of court life, the demands of his patrons, and the personal challenges he faced all combined to create a perfect storm of creativity. When he finally left Weimar for Cothen, it wasn't just a geographical shift, it was a transformation, a realization that he was ready to take on the world. And so, as we leave Bach in his cell, pondering his next move, it's worth remembering that his story is one of resilience and reinvention. He wasn't just a composer, he was a survivor, navigating the complexities of life with a grace that belied the chaos around him. The Weimar years were a testament to his ability to thrive in adversity, to find beauty in the mundane, and to turn every note into a statement of purpose. Stay tuned as we follow Bach to Cothen, where new opportunities and challenges await, and where his legacy will continue to unfold in ways even he couldn't have imagined. As Bach stepped out of his Weimar cell, it was clear he wasn't just leaving a cramped space behind, he was shedding an old skin. His next stop? Leipzig, a city that would become the canvas for his most ambitious musical masterpieces. You might think of Leipzig as some sleepy German town, but in 1723 it was a bustling hub of trade and culture with a population around 30,000. Imagine a place where merchants hawked wares from every corner of Europe. Philosophers debated over cups of coffee that tasted like the Enlightenment itself, and Bach was about to become the rock star of the church music scene. Now, before you picture Bach waltzing into Leipzig like a conquering hero, let's set the record straight. This wasn't a smooth transition, it was more like a high-stakes job interview, complete with a panel of stern Lutheran church officials. Bach had his eyes set on the position of Thomas Cantor, a role that combined the duties of a music director, choir conductor, and, let's be honest, part-time disciplinarian of rowdy choir boys. The job came with an annual salary of around 700 thalers, a decent sum, but hardly a fortune. It also included housing and a decent amount of grain, which in 18th century terms was like scoring a job with a sweet benefits package. But Leipzig was no easy gig. The city was a patriarchal stronghold where music was serious business, particularly in the church. The Thomas Cantor position meant Bach was responsible for the music at 4 major churches, including the Saintsen, Thomas Church and the St. Nicholas Church. And if you think managing one choir is hard, try juggling 4, each filled with singers who sometimes hit the wrong notes like they were playing musical dodgeball. Bach's mission was clear: elevate the city's music scene to stratospheric heights, or at least make it sound like a well-rehearsed choir rather than a group of cats auditioning for a musical. The intrigue didn't stop at church music. Bach's tenure in Leipzig was marked by a complicated dance with the city council and the consistory, a governing body that cared as much about theology as about the bottom line. These were folks who could turn a discussion about choir robes into a full-blown ecclesiastical debate. Bach had to navigate these waters like a musical Odysseus, crafting compositions that pleased both the ears and the ego of his patrons. Economically, Leipzig was a city defined by its fairs, major trade events that attracted merchants from all over Europe. These fairs were not just shopping sprees, they were the economic lifeblood of the city. Bach, ever the pragmatic genius, understood that his music could tap into this thriving marketplace. His compositions were not merely artistic expressions, they were intellectual commodities, crafted to appeal to the sophisticated tastes of educated merchants and scholars who flocked to the city. And let's not sugarcoat it. Bach wasn't just composing for the glory of God, he was composing for the glory of keeping his job. There's a myth that Bach was solely driven by divine inspiration, but the truth is, he was just as motivated by practical concerns as any modern-day freelancer. His cantatas, often written at an astonishing pace, were as much about job security as they were about artistic expression. Imagine the pressure: new music for nearly every Sunday service, each piece needing to strike the right balance between innovation and tradition. The economic pressures weren't limited to the church either. Bach had a growing family to support, and Leipzig, while prosperous, wasn't cheap. His household budget was a juggling act worthy of a circus performer, balancing the costs of raising kids, keeping up appearances, and occasionally indulging in the latest musical instruments. Bach's salary might have seemed generous, but by the time you accounted for expenses, it was clear that every thaler counted. In this environment, Bach's music flourished. His time in Leipzig saw the creation of the Saintsen, Matthew Passion, and the Mass in B minor, works that have been studied, debated, and adored for centuries. These pieces weren't just compositions, they were declarations of Bach's mastery, showcasing his ability to weave complex counterpoints and emotional depth into a tapestry of sound. They were also a testament to his ability to thrive under pressure, turning economic necessity into musical innovation. As Bach's reputation grew, so did his influence. He became a key figure in Leipzig's cultural scene, his music attracting audiences from all walks of life. But don't think for a second that this was a fairy tale of rising fame. Bach's career in Leipzig was punctuated by disputes with the city council, frustrations with unruly students, and the occasional bureaucratic nightmare. Yet, through it all, Bach remained steadfast, his music a beacon of his relentless pursuit of excellence. In Bach's Leipzig, music wasn't just an art form, it was a living, breathing entity that reflected the city's complexities. It was a time of transformation, not just for Bach, but for the entire musical landscape. His compositions were like architectural blueprints for future generations, laying the foundation for everything from classical symphonies to modern pop. And so, as we leave Bach in the midst of his Leipzig years, it's clear that his story is far from over. The challenges he faced were immense, but so too were the rewards. Bach's legacy in Leipzig is a testament to his genius, his resilience, and his ability to turn every challenge into an opportunity for greatness. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the life of a man who wasn't just a composer, but a musical visionary whose influence resonates to this day. As we continue our journey through Bach's life, let's not forget that his story didn't just end with a crescendo in Leipzig. The man who gave us some of the most intricate music ever composed died in 1750, leaving behind a legacy that was, for a time, as dusty as an old church pew. At his death, Bach was buried in an unmarked grave in St. John's Cemetery in Leipzig, a rather unceremonious exit for a guy whose music echoed with celestial grandeur. His passing wasn't headline news, it was more like a footnote in the era's grand narrative. Immediately after his death, Bach's music didn't exactly top the charts. His compositions were seen as too complex, too dense for the new wave of classical music that preferred a more straightforward melody. The age of enlightenment was in full swing, and people were more interested in catchy tunes than intricate fugues. Think of it as the difference between a gourmet meal and fast food. Both have their place, but one is easier to digest at a casual gathering. But Bach's music was like a time capsule waiting to be cracked open. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the Romantic era was all about rediscovering the past. Enter Felix Mendelssohn, the 20-year-old wonderkind who decided to dust off Bach's St. Matthew Passion in 1829, like a DJ remixing a forgotten classic. Mendelssohn's revival was a hit, and suddenly Bach was back on the playlist. His compositions were re-evaluated, and people started realizing what they'd been missing. A genius who could turn musical notes into a tapestry of emotion and complexity. The rediscovery of Bach's work was like finding buried treasure. Scholars, musicians, and composers began to study his compositions with the fervor of archaeologists unearthing an ancient civilization. Bach's music became a benchmark, a standard against which others were measured. His creations were hailed as the pinnacle of musical achievement, influencing giants like Beethoven and Mozart. It was as if Bach had left a musical map for future generations to follow, and suddenly everyone wanted to be part of the journey. Now, let's talk myths. Bach's life has been romanticized to the point where he's practically a musical saint in some circles. The image of the tortured genius, composing by candlelight, has its appeal, but let's not forget the gritty realities he faced. Bach wasn't some aloof artist detached from the world. He was a working man, balancing the demands of a large family with the pressures of his career. His life was less about divine inspiration and more about hard work, perseverance, and a knack for navigating the political and economic landscapes of his time. The truth is, Bach's legacy is as much about his resilience as his genius. He was a man who knew how to hustle, a composer who understood that music was as much a craft as an art. He wasn't just composing for the ages, he was composing to keep food on the table and his family sheltered. The idea that he was only driven by some ethereal muse is as much a fairy tale as the notion that he never faced failure or rejection. Yet, despite the harsh realities, there's an undeniable romance in his story. In a world that often seemed indifferent, Bach's music was a testament to the power of the human spirit. His compositions spoke of beauty, of complexity, of emotion in a language that transcended the spoken word. It's no wonder that his work continues to captivate audiences centuries later. Bach didn't just write music, he created an enduring legacy that defies the confines of time. As we wrap up this exploration of Bach's life, it's clear that his significance lies not only in his compositions, but in his ability to overcome adversity. He was a master of reinvention, a man who turned every challenge into an opportunity to create something extraordinary. His story is a reminder that genius is rarely a solitary pursuit. It's a dance between inspiration and reality, between dreams and the harsh truths of life. Bach's legacy is a symphony of contradictions, a blend of romance and realism that continues to resonate today. His music remains a testament to the enduring power of creativity, a reminder that even in the face of obscurity, true genius will always find its audience. And so, as we close the final chapter on Johann Sebastian Bach, let's celebrate not just the notes he wrote, but the life he lived. A life that, much like his music, was a masterpiece in its own right. In the bustling heart of ancient Athens, you are a hoplite, the stalwart citizen soldier whose life is as much a balancing act as it is a martial endeavour. You've got a lot on your plate, but let's start with the essentials, your armour. It's not just any set of gear, it's a bronze shell that could make or break your standing, both literally and figuratively. The hoplon, your shield, isn't just for show. It's a 20-pound wooden disc covered in bronze that's as much a symbol of your civic duty as it is your lifeline on the battlefield. And it's not cheap. We're talking about 30 drachmas for the shield alone, which, back in the day, could feed an Athenian family for a month. So, you better take care of it. Now, let's talk about your helmet, the Corinthian masterpiece that hugs your head like a glorified sardine can. It's designed to protect you, but also quite possibly to deafen you in battle. You see, the ancient Athenians may not have nailed acoustics, but they sure knew how to make a statement. The rest of your gear includes a breastplate, greaves, and a dory spear that's about 8 feet long. All in all, you're carrying around 70 pounds of gear, which is a serious workout for your average Wednesday, but a serious pain when the mercury rises. And you're footing the bill for this ensemble. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of today's student loans, but with more immediate consequences if you default. But don't get too comfortable with your gear just yet. You've got training to attend. Every Athenian male citizen between the ages of 18 and 60 is expected to serve as a hoplite when called upon. It's compulsory military service with a twist. Your service isn't just a duty, it's a full-blown cultural expectation. The phalanx formation is your bread and butter, a dense block of shields that's about as close as you'll get to a human tank. Forget personal space. You're shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens, relying on each other to keep formation and, quite literally, to have each other's backs. Now, if you think this is all about flexing military muscle, think again. Being a hoplite is a political statement. You're a member of the Athenian ecclesia, the assembly where you and thousands of your peers debate the future of the city-state. It's direct democracy in action, where every citizen has a voice, provided they're male, free, and not a metic. Those are resident foreigners, in case you're wondering. You're wielding both a sword and a vote, and that makes your role in society pretty unique. But let's not romanticize this too much. Balancing your civic duties with family life is no small feat. By day, you might be called to the Phoenix to vote on matters of war and peace, and by night you're back to the grind, tending to your farm or craft. If you're lucky, you own a small plot of land, and if not, you're dependent on your skills as a craftsman. Either way, there's no time to waste. Ancient Greece is not known for its leisurely lifestyle, despite the idyllic image of philosophers lounging around in togas. Let's be real, they were probably just avoiding their chores. And while we're on the topic of chores, your home life is far from the democratic ideal. Your wife manages the household, and her world rarely intersects with the political sphere you navigate. Women's roles are confined to the domestic, and their influence, though crucial, is often invisible in the grand narratives of the polis. You might hear the occasional joke about women and their supposed inability to comprehend politics, but the reality is, their exclusion is a societal construct, not an inherent truth. As you juggle these responsibilities, remember that your status as a hoplite is both a privilege and a burden. You're part of the elite, not because of wealth or birth, but because you can afford to arm yourself and stand in the phalanx. This is the paradox of Athenian democracy, a society that prides itself on equality but is built on the backs of those who can afford to participate. It's a system that works, until it doesn't, often at the expense of those who are left out. So here you are, a hoplite in 5th century BC Athens, straddling the line between soldier and citizen, navigating the complexities of a society that is both ahead of its time and deeply entrenched in its traditions. Your life is an endless negotiation of duty, loyalty, and survival, coloured by the grandiose ideals of democracy and the gritty realities of everyday life. As you prepare for whatever challenge the day throws your way, remember, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And you, my friend, are living one of its most compelling verses. Now, speaking of compelling verses, let's dive into the daily grind of your life as a hoplite. Training isn't just a passing hobby, it's practically a full-time job. You didn't just wake up one morning as a soldier, oh no, this is a lifestyle choice, not unlike committing to a CrossFit regimen or, for the less athletically inclined, binge-watching every season of a show because you're too invested to stop. Your training starts with physical conditioning. Think intense calisthenics, running, and maybe even the ancient equivalent of weightlifting, though no dumbbells here, just good old-fashioned rocks and lobs. Your body is your greatest weapon, and it's got to be in peak form. After all, you're not just fighting to protect your city, you're flexing for it too, in the most literal sense. And you're not alone. Every able-bodied male citizen, from the young whippersnappers at 18 to the grizzled veterans nearing 60, is out sweating on the practice field. You're all in this together, a brotherhood bound by sweat, duty, and the occasional side-eye when someone forgets to shower. Now, mastering the phalanx formation is where things get both thrilling and claustrophobic. It's not about individual glory, save that for the poets, it's about discipline and teamwork. The phalanx is a dense formation, a wall of shields and spears that moves as one, like a well-oiled machine or a particularly aggressive game of human Tetris. You're packed in tighter than a can of sardines, and personal space is a luxury you can't afford. The idea is simple: lock shields, thrust spears, and push forward. The execution? A different story. It takes endless drills to perfect the synchronized movements, to trust the guy next to you not to trip over his own feet and ruin the whole thing. And let's not forget the gear maintenance. It's not like you can just pop down to the Agora and buy a new helmet every week. That armor, it's your responsibility to keep it in fighting shape, which is a bit like owning a car that breaks down every time you look at it funny. The cost of maintaining your kit is no joke, about a drachma a day. That's a significant investment when you consider that a drachma could buy you a decent loaf of bread or, if you're feeling fancy, a nice hunk of cheese. But here's the kicker. When you're off playing soldier, your farm or trade isn't exactly flourishing in your absence. Every day spent in training or on campaign is a day not spent sowing fields or crafting pottery. And your family? They're left to hold down the fort, literally and figuratively. It's an economic sacrifice, one that's expected, sure, but painful nonetheless. It's a bit like taking unpaid leave, except your boss is the state, and they expect you to come back with scars and stories, not suntans and souvenirs. Now, about that Spartan envy, it's real and it's palpable. Athens might pride itself on its intellect and democratic ideals, but there's a part of every Athenian hoplite that looks at the Spartans with a mix of awe and, dare we say, a touch of jealousy. The Spartans are the poster boys of ancient military prowess, the rock stars of combat, with a lifestyle that's all about that warrior grind 24/7. Their whole society is a well-oiled war machine, and while you're busy debating the finer points of politics and philosophy, they're out perfecting the art of making enemies regret their life choices. But don't let that Spartan sheen fool you. Their lifestyle isn't exactly the stuff of dreams. It's more like a non-stop boot camp with no room for individuality. You could argue that their society sacrifices too much for martial excellence, but you better do it quietly. Spartans aren't known for their sense of humor. And let's talk logistics, because nothing says glamorous ancient soldier like the nitty-gritty of camp life. Marching distances are no joke. Imagine trekking 15 to 20 miles a day. In armor, under the sun, with nothing but stale bread and diluted wine to keep you going. It's less epic campaign and more hiking trip from hell. When night falls, you're not checking into a cozy inn, you're setting up camp, which is a euphemism for sleeping on the ground and trying not to think about what's crawling around in the dark. Camp life is a mix of camaraderie and discomfort. You're sharing stories, cracking jokes, and trying to keep morale high, all while dealing with the very real threat of disease and the lack of decent sanitation. It's a test of endurance, both physical and mental, and not everyone passes with flying colours. So here you are, navigating the realities of being a hoplite, where the glory of battle is often overshadowed by the grind of preparation. It's a life of contrasts, where ideals meet the harsh light of reality, and every stride forward is a testament to resilience and resolve. As you continue along this path, remember that the story of the Athenian hoplite is as much about the journey as it is the battles fought. And there's more to this epic tale, so stay tuned for the next chapter, where the stakes get higher and the challenges even more daunting. So, here you are, standing shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx, a wall of bronze and determination, ready to face whatever chaos the battlefield throws your way. This isn't just some ancient version of a pick-up football game. It's war, with stakes so high they make Mount Olympus look like a molehill. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of what it really means to be on the front lines as a hoplite, beyond the polished heroics that poets love to sing about. First off, the phalanx isn't for the faint of heart or the claustrophobic. Imagine being packed so tightly with your fellow soldiers that personal space becomes a distant memory. Like that time you thought a toga party was a good idea. Your hoplon, that trusty 20-pound shield of yours, isn't just saving your skin, it's also covering half of the guy next to you. If he's having an off day, well, you better be quick on your feet. This formation is the ultimate test of teamwork, and if one link in the chain falters, the whole thing can unravel faster than a politician caught in a scandal. Now, the real crux of this ancient battlefield ballet is the othismos, or the push. Forget any notion of a genteel exchange of blows. This is a full-blown, visceral shove-fest, with each side trying to out-muscle the other. Picture a rugby scrum, but instead of a ball, you've got spears and shields, and instead of a friendly game, it's a fight for survival. Herodotus and Thucydides may have romanticized the heroics, but they didn't spare the gory details. The push is a test of raw strength and grit, and if you're not bracing your legs properly, you're likely to end up horizontal in a hurry. And then there's the sheer noise of it all. The clatter of metal on metal, the grunts and shouts of hundreds of men, the pounding of your own heartbeat in your ears. It's sensory overload at its finest, and that Corinthian helmet, while great for keeping arrows at bay, isn't exactly noise-cancelling. You can barely hear your own thoughts, let alone any commands being shouted over the din. It's organized chaos, with the emphasis often leaning heavily on the chaos. But let's not kid ourselves. There's a psychological toll here too, and it's not just the fear of catching a spear in the gut. You're facing men who, quite frankly, are just as terrified as you are. It's a brutal reminder of the shared humanity that lies beneath all the bravado. The ground is slippery with more than just mud. It's sweat, blood, and the occasional bit of yesterday's dinner making an unceremonious return. Glory might be the goal, but survival is the name of the game, and it's a game with no guarantees. Now, the poets and playwrights might wax lyrical about the honour and valour of the hoplite, but the truth is messier. The aftermath of battle is a harsh tableau of reality, with friends and foes alike left lying on the field. Those who can still stand are tasked with the grim duty of retrieving the fallen and salvaging what gear they can. Armour doesn't come cheap, and in the aftermath of the clash, stripping the dead is as much about economics as it is about respect for the deceased. It's a sobering reminder that war is as much about survival as it is about strategy. Speaking of strategy, let's talk tactics, because the phalanx doesn't just charge blindly into battle. There's a method to the madness, a calculated dance that requires precision and timing. The generals, often veterans themselves, play this human chess game with lives on the line. Flanking maneuvers, fake retreats, and strategic withdrawals are all part of the playbook, designed to outwit and outlast the enemy. It's less about brute force and more about who can keep their cool under pressure. And while the phalanx is famed for its defensive prowess, it's not infallible. Break the ranks, and it's every hoplite for himself, a chaotic rush to regroup or retreat depending on the tide of battle. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on the romanticized notion of the warrior's death, that glorious sacrifice sung by bards. The grim reality is far from poetic. It's a messy, visceral affair where the ideal of dying for your polis clashes with the instinctual desire to stay alive. The psychological burden of knowing that today's battle might be your last is a heavy one, and it's not something that can be shrugged off with a rousing speech or a swig of watered-down wine. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, there's a camaraderie that forms, a bond forged in the crucible of combat that's hard to replicate anywhere else. The man next to you isn't just a fellow citizen, he's your lifeline, your partner in this perilous dance. You may bicker and jostle, but when the chips are down, you trust him with your life because, quite frankly, your lives depend on each other. It's a brotherhood unlike any other, one that transcends the petty squabbles of daily life and reminds you of your shared purpose. But before you start thinking this is all doom and gloom, let's not forget the moments of unexpected levity. Gallows humour is alive and well among hoplites, a coping mechanism as old as war itself. Jokes about the enemy's poor taste in helmets, or the absurdity of fighting over a patch of land that's mostly rocks, serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, laughter can be a powerful weapon. It's a way to reclaim a bit of humanity in an inhumane situation, to find light even when surrounded by shadows. As the dust settles and the battle concludes, there's no time for rest. The work continues, from tending to the wounded to burying the dead. The cost of war isn't just measured in lives lost, but in the scars, visible and invisible, that linger long after the fighting has stopped. It's a sobering reality that contrasts sharply with the tales of glory that will be recounted in the agora. So there you have it, the gritty, unvarnished truth of life as a hoplite on the battlefield. It's a world where honour and horror walk hand in hand, where the ideals of heroism clash with the brutal reality of war. Yet, despite the chaos and uncertainty, there's a strange allure to it all, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring appeal of the stories we tell ourselves about courage and camaraderie. As you prepare to return to the city, weary but alive, you carry with you the knowledge that this chapter of history is far from over. The lessons learned on the battlefield will shape the future of Athens and its citizens, influencing decisions in the ecclesia and the direction of the polis. The story of the hoplite isn't just about battles fought and won, it's about the enduring struggle to balance the ideals of democracy with the realities of a world at war. And with that, we'll leave the battlefield behind for now, with more tales yet to be told. There's plenty more to explore in this saga of ancient Athens, so stay tuned for the next installment, where the stakes will rise and the challenges will only grow more formidable. Until then, keep your shield steady and your spirit strong, because the story of the hoplite is far from finished. As we leave the battlefield behind, let's pivot to the aftermath of all that glorious, and let's be real, often gory action. The battle may be over, but the real work has just begun, and the stakes are higher than a Greek god's opinion of himself. You're back in Athens now, and it's time to deal with the consequences, both the tangible and the unseen. First up, the spoils of war. Not quite the picture of chests overflowing with gold and jewels you might be imagining. We're talking more about the practical loot here, weapons, armour, and the occasional bit of livestock if you're lucky. Remember, a hoplite's gear is expensive, and losing a helmet in the heat of battle is like watching your paycheck sail away in the wind. So, stripping the battlefield isn't just a grim task, it's an economic necessity. You've got to recoup those losses, because, let's face it, your creditors don't care if you've just come back from hell and back, they want their drachmas. Now, about those economic incentives. Spoils of war could certainly sweeten the deal for those who survived, acting as a bonus for your trouble. But there's also the potential for societal accolades, which are kind of like the ancient equivalent of winning the Best Employee Award, except this one might get you a nice statue or at least a mention in some poet's ode. Glory and honour are on the line, and in a society that values reputation as much as Athens does, that's no small thing. A name immortalized in stone might not pay the bills, but it does wonders for your standing in the ecclesia. But let's not gloss over the grim reality that war exacts a heavy toll, especially on your health. The physical consequences are all too real. Injuries sustained in battle can mean a lifetime of pain or disability, assuming you survive, of course. The Hoplite's life is not one of invincibility, despite what those heroic busts might suggest. A shattered leg, a punctured lung, or the loss of a limb doesn't just end a soldier's career, it can wreck a family's livelihood. Suddenly, that farm needs tending, and you're down an able-bodied worker. It's a harsh reminder that the hero's return isn't always triumphant. Sometimes it's just a struggle to regain a semblance of normalcy. And let's talk about trauma. The invisible wound that rarely gets a mention in those grand tales of valor. Today, we call it PTSD. But back then, it was just the unspoken shadow that haunted many a veteran. Nightmares, anxiety, and the inability to reintegrate into civilian life were common, yet often misunderstood. The psychological scars of war are every bit as debilitating as the physical ones, and they ripple through families and communities, affecting everyone in their wake. Back home, the impact on families is profound. The absence of husbands, fathers, and sons leaves gaps that can't be easily filled. Women and children are left to manage households and farms, and while their contributions are vital, they're often overlooked in the historical narrative. It's a society that values the warrior, yet it's the ones left behind who bear much of the burden. This dichotomy is a reminder that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. Now, let's debunk the myth of the invincible warrior. The romantic notion of the hoplite as an unstoppable force of nature is just that, a notion. The reality is messier. These soldiers were human, with all the frailties and fears that come with it. Yes, they trained hard and fought bravely, but they weren't superheroes. Many didn't return, and those who did often carried more than just physical scars. The legend of the hoplite is one of resilience and courage, yes, but also one of vulnerability and sacrifice. So where does that leave us? In a world where the line between legend and reality is more blurred than a philosopher's moral compass, the hoplite story is one of nuance, where the ideals of glory and honour clash with the stark truths of survival and loss. It's a tale that reminds us that history is not just about the battles fought, but about the lives lived in their shadows. And as we prepare to delve deeper into this saga, remember that the hoplite's legacy is one of complexity. It's not just about the armour or the accolades, it's about the human experience at its most raw and real. Stay tuned for more as we continue to unravel the myths and uncover the truths of ancient Athens, one spear thrust at a time. And so we forge ahead, unraveling the tangled yarn of the hoplite's legacy, a tale woven with threads of valour, democracy, and a dash of Spartan envy for good measure. The story of these citizen soldiers is etched into the bedrock of Athenian society and, by extension, the annals of Western civilization. But what sort of legacy have they left behind? And just how much of it is real versus the stuff of legend, puffed up with the hot air of ancient propaganda? Start with the obvious. These guys were the backbone of Athenian military might, the original human tank, if you will. With their phalanx formation, they revolutionized warfare, turning what could have been chaotic clashes into something resembling strategy. The phalanx was as much about finesse as it was about force, a testament to the power of collective action. Forget the lone hero charging into battle with a sword held high. This was a team sport, a full-contact chess game where every move counted. And the impact of this tactical innovation? Monumental. It spread like olive oil on a Greek salad, influencing military tactics across the Aegean and beyond. But hold your horses. Before we go crowning these warriors as the saviours of democracy and military strategy, let's dig a little deeper. The hoplites' role in advancing democracy is a bit of a mixed bag. Sure, they were foot soldiers for the world's first democracy, fighting for their city-state and, in a way, for their right to vote. But remember, the Athenian democracy was a gated community of sorts. If you weren't a male landowner with a hoplite's gear, your voice in the ecclesia was about as loud as a Spartan at a poetry reading. It's a system that spoke of equality and freedom yet was built on the exclusion of women, slaves, and metics, those resident foreigners who, despite living in Athens, had about as much say in politics as a rock. So, while the hoplites were soldiering away for democracy, they were simultaneously upholding a system that was, let's face it, a bit of a paradox. They were the embodiment of the city-state's ideals, yet their very existence highlighted the inequalities within it. It's like throwing a party for everyone and then only letting in the folks who brought their own bottle of wine. Athenian democracy was groundbreaking, no doubt, but it was far from perfect. And then there's the cultural identity angle. The hoplites weren't just muscle, they were a symbol of Athenian pride, the living embodiment of their city's spirit. Yet, this identity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, you had the glory of the citizen soldier, the pride of defending your home with spear in hand. On the other, there was the grim reality of a life defined by war and its aftermath. The cultural narrative painted hoplites as heroes, yet the day-to-day grind was anything but heroic. It was hard work, and not the kind that earned you laurel wreaths. The hoplite's life was a constant balancing act between duty and survival, ideals and reality. Fast forward to today, and the legacy of the hoplite still casts a shadow over military and civic traditions. Modern armies owe a nod to the hoplite's phalanx, a granddaddy of tactics that evolved into the disciplined formations seen in military parades and historical reenactments. And while we might not see soldiers marching into battle with bronze shields any longer, the spirit of the phalanx lives on in teamwork, discipline, and an understanding that strength lies in unity. Civically, the notion of the citizen soldier has echoed through the ages, morphing into the concept of compulsory military service seen in various forms around the world. It's the ancient idea that citizenship comes with responsibilities, that the privileges of living in a community come with strings attached. It's an ideal that resonates, even if the execution has, at times, been lacking. But what about the romanticized legacy? The image of the hoplite as the perfect warrior, the democrat in armor, is one that's hard to shake. We love a good hero story after all, and the hoplite fits the bill nicely. Yet, this narrative glosses over the complexities and contradictions that define their lives. It's a bit like looking at a statue and ignoring the cracks. The reality is that the hoplite's legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reflection of humanity's perpetual dance between ideals and imperfections. As we wrap up this historical escapade, let's leave with a few sharp observations to chew on. The hoplite story is a reminder of the power of collective action and the importance of civic duty, even when it's inconvenient or downright unpleasant. It's a tale that underscores the precarious balance between progress and tradition, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we live. And maybe, just maybe, it's a nudge to question the narratives handed down through the ages, to sift through the myths and uncover the gritty reality beneath. So, as you drift off to sleep with these tales of ancient warriors swirling in your mind, remember this: history is a mosaic, a tapestry of stories both grand and grim. And the hoplite's legacy, like much of history, is a reminder that the past is never just one thing. It's a complex, messy, beautiful collection of truths and tales, each worth exploring, questioning, and understanding. Sweet dreams, fellow history buff, and may your thoughts be as sharp as a hoplite's spear. Young Johann Sebastian Bach wasn't handed his genius on a silver platter. Nope, it was more like it was baked into his genes and then tossed into the deep end of a musical pool without a life preserver. Born in 1605 in the charming town of Eisenach, smack dab in the middle of what is now Germany, Bach had more musical lineage than you could shake a harpsichord at. His family tree was like the Spotify playlist of 17th century musicians, each branch bursting with composers, organists, and cantors. If your last name was Bach and you couldn't play an instrument, you were basically the black sheep of the family. But life wasn't all counterpoint and harmony. By the tender age of 10, Johann Sebastian was orphaned. Both his parents, Johann Ambrosius and Maria Elizabeth, had shuffled off this mortal coil, leaving him to be raised by his older brother, Johann Christoph. This guy wasn't just any brother, he was an organist in Ohrdruf, and let's just say teaching little Johann wasn't exactly a priority. Imagine having to put up with a kid brother who's not only talented, but also has an annoying habit of sneaking into your music stash to copy your precious scores by moonlight. Yep, Johann Sebastian did just that, his nocturnal activities earning him a good scolding when he got caught. Yet this rebellious little escapade gave him access to works by composers like Johann Pachelbel, which was kind of like a modern teen pilfering their siblings' vinyl collection to discover the Beatles. Bach's youthful years were more about absorbing everything he could from his surroundings than creating any musical revolutions. But let's not fall into the trap of thinking young Johann was some sort of rebellious rock star. The myth that Bach engaged in a grand music duel with the French composer Louis Marchand is one of those tales that spices up the history books but doesn't quite hold water. The story goes that the two were supposed to face off in a musical showdown, but Marchand supposedly bailed after hearing Bach practice. While it makes for a fantastic narrative, there's no hard evidence this ever happened. It's a prime example of how Bach's reputation for unmatched skill has snowballed into legend over the centuries. Bach's real life was more about the grind than the glory. He spent his teenage years honing his skills, travelling to Lüneburg, a good 300 kilometres north, to attend St. Michael's School. There, he had access to a library stocked with the musical greats, composers like Dietrich Buxtehude and Antonio Vivaldi. And let's not forget the church's organ, which Johann played like nobody's business. It was here that he soaked up a smorgasbord of musical styles, setting the stage for his future masterpieces. Despite his early setbacks, young Bach was a sponge for music, soaking up influences far and wide. His prodigious talent was already apparent, and he was far more interested in perfecting his craft than getting caught up in any rebellious antics. By the time he took his first official job at 18 as a court musician in Weimar, his path was already paved with the notes and scales that would eventually change the musical world. In these early years, Bach was less of a rebel and more of a relentless student, hell-bent on mastering the intricacies of his craft. It's these formative experiences that shaped Bach into the musical powerhouse he would become. His family's legacy, coupled with the hardships of being orphaned, instilled a discipline and dedication that would see him through the ups and downs of his career. So next time you hear a Bach fugue, remember, it's the result of a lifetime of learning, practice, and a dash of youthful rebellion. Just not the kind that involves duels or defying authority. Instead, it's the quiet, persistent kind of rebellion that involves sneaking around for clandestine sheet music and surpassing every expectation that life, family, and society set for him. Now let's hit the fast-forward button to 1708, where we find our man Johann Sebastian, a 23-year-old hotshot taking on the role of court musician in Weimar. This wasn't any old gig, it was a big deal. Weimar had a reputation for being a cultural hotspot, and landing a job there was like scoring front-row tickets to the biggest concert in town. Yet, even in this prestigious position, Bach's life wasn't exactly a walk in the Baroque park. Bach's time in Weimar was a mix of high notes and low blows. He was under the employ of Duke Wilhelm Ernst, a man with a penchant for music but also a stickler for rules. Think of him as the kind of boss who'd give you a bonus for exceptional work, but wouldn't let you leave early on your birthday. Bach was responsible for composing and performing music for the court, a task that included everything from writing church cantatas to dazzling guests at the Duke's soirees with his organ prowess. But there was a catch. Bach was paid a modest salary of about 150 florins a year. To put that in context, it was enough to keep him fed and clothed, but not exactly living in the lap of luxury. Despite the financial constraints, Bach thrived creatively during his Weimar years. He composed some of his most enduring works, including those famous organ pieces that make even the most stoic listener feel like they've stumbled upon a celestial revelation. But let's not get too misty-eyed here. The reality was that Bach was part of an 18th century gig economy that treated musicians like musical mercenaries, constantly on the lookout for better pay, more creative freedom, or simply a boss who wouldn't micromanage their every note. By 1717, Bach's reputation as a composer and performer had skyrocketed, and it was time to make some career moves. Enter Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, who offered Bach a position that promised both creative freedom and a substantial pay raise. It was the kind of job offer you'd be a fool to refuse. Excited by the prospect, Bach decided to give his notice to Duke Wilhelm Ernst. Unfortunately, the Duke wasn't one to let go easily. Picture your boss refusing to acknowledge your resignation, and then locking you in the office for a month. That's pretty much what happened to Bach. The Duke had Bach jailed for nearly a month, a move that was legal back then but, let's face it, would be a PR nightmare today. While the romanticized version of this story paints Bach as a defiant artist standing up to authority, the reality is a bit more nuanced. This wasn't just about artistic freedom, it was about economic survival. Musicians of Bach's time were often treated like skilled labor, valued for their craft but expendable and subject to the whims of their patrons. In Bach's case, his jail time was less about artistic rebellion and more about a power struggle in a world where musicians were pawns in the grand chess game of aristocratic politics. After his stint in an 18th century version of a time-out corner, Bach finally made his way to Kärnten. It was here that he would compose some of his most famous secular works, including the Brandenburg Concertos. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in Weimar, Bach's imprisonment was a turning point, highlighting the precarious balance musicians had to maintain between artistic passion and economic necessity. It's a tale as old as time chasing dreams while trying to keep the lights on. So, the next time you hear one of Bach's compositions, think of the young composer who, despite being jailed for his ambitions, never stopped pursuing the perfect harmony between creative expression and practical reality. It's a reminder that even the most revered geniuses had to navigate the rocky waters of the job market, proving that the struggle between art and economics is as timeless as music itself. And so, Johann Sebastian Bach, fresh from his little stint behind bars and having successfully navigated the treacherous waters of musical employment, found himself in Leipzig in 1723. Leipzig, a city that managed to be both a cultural mecca and a bureaucratic quagmire. It was like the Silicon Valley of its time, but instead of tech startups, it was all about music, trade, and a fair amount of sausage manufacturing. Bach was appointed as the Thomaskantor, a fancy title that meant he was in charge of the music at St. Thomas Church and its associated school. This role was no walk in the park, even a Baroque one. It required him to compose, teach, and direct music for 4 churches in the city. Imagine juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. That's the level of multitasking we're talking about. But Bach wasn't complaining. With a salary of 100 florins, plus a little extra here and there for funerals and weddings, he was making a solid middle-class living. He even had a nice apartment thrown into the deal, right above the school, which was handy for keeping an eye on his teenage charges. Now, about those 20 children. You might wonder how Bach managed to compose over 1,000 works, while also playing personal conductor to his sprawling family orchestra. Well, it's important to remember that not all his children survived to adulthood, a harsh reality of the 18th century. Of the 20, only about 10 made it past childhood. It's a sobering statistic that reminds us life was less about the symphony and more about survival back then. Yet, Bach was far from the stereotypical tortured artist. Sure, he had his grumbles, especially when city officials poked their noses into his business. There was the infamous spat in 1730, when Bach wrote a letter to the Leipzig council essentially saying, "Hey, I need more musicians, and you're giving me scraps." It was a polite but firm nudge, a professional do better. That was less about his personal angst and more about the practical demands of his job. His music, though full of emotional depth, wasn't an outlet for personal demons, but a testament to his work ethic and genius. Leipzig was a whirlwind of productivity for Bach. His most famous work from this period was the St. Matthew Passion, a monumental piece that required a veritable army of singers and musicians. It's the kind of work that makes you wonder if Bach ever slept, or if he just powered through on sheer caffeine and divine inspiration. While the romance of the tortured artist suggests he was fueled by inner turmoil, the reality was more likely a potent mix of talent, discipline, and the need to meet a deadline. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, Bach's supposed lack of international fame during his lifetime. It's a narrative that paints him as an unsung genius, toiling away in obscurity. But this is less a tale of neglect and more a reflection of the times. Back then, fame didn't travel at the speed of a tweet. Music was local, and composers were craftsmen, not celebrities. Bach was well respected in his circle, and while he didn't bask in Beatles-level notoriety, he was far from an unknown. He was revered by those who mattered, his peers and patrons. As for his teaching duties, Bach was more than just a composer. He was an educator shaping the next generation of musicians. He taught singing, Latin, and music theory. Picture a classroom where Bach, with his distinctive wig and stern demeanor, is guiding a bunch of teenage boys through the finer points of counterpoint. It's not exactly a scene of artistic brooding, but rather one of disciplined mentorship. In this environment, Bach didn't just survive. He thrived. His time in Leipzig was marked by a relentless push for musical perfection. He was like the Steve Jobs of Baroque music, obsessed with detail and excellence. Yet, despite the pressures, he found joy in his work and his family. It's a reminder that while we love the image of the artist as a solitary genius, the truth is often more mundane and, dare I say, inspiring. Bach was a man who balanced the demands of a large family with the intricate dance of notes and scales, all while navigating the bureaucratic maze of Leipzig's musical landscape. So, as we leave Bach in the thick of his Leipzig years, composing masterpieces and raising a family, let's dispel the myth of the tortured artist. Bach wasn't tortured, he was busy. Busy creating, teaching, and living in a world that valued music as both art and craft. His genius wasn't fueled by suffering, but by a love for his work and a determination to make the most of his time on earth. A lesson as timeless as his music. So here we are, leaving Bach in the bustling musical hub of Leipzig, a city that made even the most organized among us reach for an extra cup of coffee. Bach was riding the wave of his own creativity, meticulously crafting pieces that would echo through the ages. Yet, as the final notes of his life symphony played out, it seemed the world was ready to turn down the volume on his genius. When Bach shuffled off this mortal coil in 1750, his music didn't exactly get the rock star farewell. Instead, it quietly slipped into the background like an old vinyl collecting dust in the attic. Bach had been a big deal in his day, but posthumously, his brilliance flickered rather than blazed. His sons, particularly Carl Philipp Emanuel and Johann Christian, were making their own musical waves, and their styles were all the rage. The new kids on the block were embracing the gallant style, a simpler, more melodic approach, and Bach's intricate counterpoints were suddenly so last season. But why did Bach's music fade into obscurity? Well, the man himself was a product of the Baroque era, a time when composers were craftsmen, not divas. Music was more about function than fame. Bach's intricate fugues and complex harmonies were crafted for the church and court, not for a public obsessed with catchy tunes. And let's not forget that back then, musical scores weren't mass-produced like today. If you wanted to spread music, you practically needed a mini army of scribes. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Bach's works were more or less a well-kept secret among a small circle of enthusiasts. His compositions were like vintage wine, appreciated by a select few who understood their depth. But then, like a plot twist in an epic novel, Bach's music was about to get its second act. Enter Felix Mendelssohn, a young composer with a penchant for resurrecting musical ghosts. In 1829, Mendelssohn conducted a performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion in Berlin, the first since Bach's death. It was an audacious move, akin to digging out a forgotten masterpiece and displaying it as the crown jewel of an art exhibit. The performance was a resounding success, akin to a long-lost album suddenly hitting the top of the charts. Mendelssohn, a man who himself was no stranger to musical greatness, understood the staying power of Bach's work and threw open the floodgates for a full-blown Bach revival. And just like that, Bach was back in vogue, like a retro band suddenly headlining Coachella. His music was re-evaluated, reprinted, and revered in a way that would have made him blush under his powdered wig. By the mid-19th century, Bach was hailed as one of the greatest composers of all time, with his works becoming a staple in the education of every serious musician. His music was no longer just an academic exercise. It was a testament to the timeless nature of true genius. This renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering his music, it was about reshaping Bach's legacy. The myth of the forgotten genius was romanticized, turning Bach into a symbol of misunderstood brilliance. The reality, however, was less about neglect and more about timing. Bach lived in an era where music was local and ephemeral, and his posthumous obscurity was a reflection of the natural ebb and flow of artistic tastes. Economically speaking, the revival was a boon for music publishers and concert halls. Bach's works, once scattered and rare, were now in high demand. Printing Bach's music became a lucrative business, and performers clamoured to showcase his compositions to eager audiences. The man who had lived on a modest salary was now generating wealth from beyond the grave, a posthumous success story that would make any struggling artist envious. Politically, the revival of Bach's music tapped into a sense of cultural nationalism sweeping through 19th-century Europe. Germany, in particular, embraced Bach as a symbol of national heritage, a musical titan who represented the pinnacle of German art. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a way to forge a cultural identity in a rapidly changing world. Bach's music became a rallying point, a reminder of the enduring power of creativity and tradition. So, as Bach's legacy was cemented in the halls of musical history, we're left with a curious paradox: the man who was both revered and forgotten, celebrated and overlooked. It's a reminder that genius isn't always recognized in its own time, and sometimes it takes a few centuries for the world to catch up. Bach's story defies the neat narratives we love to tell about prodigies and their rise to fame. Instead, it's a testament to the unpredictable nature of artistic legacy, a whirlwind of talent, timing, and a little bit of luck. As we prepare to delve deeper into the final act of Bach's story, let's hold on to the idea that genius doesn't always shine brightest in its own era. Sometimes it takes a little dusting off and a fresh perspective to truly appreciate the brilliance that was there all along. So, hang tight, because Bach's journey is far from over and there's still plenty of music to be played. So, we find ourselves at the crescendo of Johann Sebastian Bach's story, a tale that's less about the man and more about the music that refused to fade into obscurity. Fast forward a few hundred years, and Bach's influence is like that stubborn song you just can't get out of your head, except this one's been on repeat for about 3 centuries. His work is the uninvited guest that crashes every genre's party, from classical to jazz to pop. It's like that universal adapter you never knew you needed. But let's backtrack a bit and unpack why Bach's music has this uncanny ability to transcend time. First off, Bach was a bit of a numbers geek. His compositions are like the musical equivalent of a Fibonacci sequence. Mathematically precise yet artistically vibrant. It's this intricate blend of logic and beauty that makes his music resonate with so many. Take Glenn Gould's iconic 1955 recording of the Goldberg Variations. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first 5 years. Not too shabby for a set of variations that were originally designed to lull a Russian ambassador to sleep. And let's talk about jazz for a moment. Bach's improvisational flair is basically jazz before jazz was cool. His ability to weave complex harmonies and counterpoints laid the groundwork for the improvisational styles that jazz musicians adore. Ever heard of Jacques Roussier? This French pianist sold over 6 million albums by jazzing up Bach's classics. His trio's rendition of Air on the G-string is a prime example of how Bach's work lends itself to a genre defined by spontaneity and expression. Now, if you think Bach is just for the Mozart-loving, powdered wig-wearing crowd, think again. The appeal of his music stretches across the aisle to pop music like a musical ambassador. The Beatles, those mop-topped icons of the 60s, were known to sprinkle a little Bach into their songs. Blackbird, for instance, owes part of its harmonic structure to Bach's Bourrée in E minor. And let's not overlook how the likes of Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale borrowed from Air on the G-string. With over 10 million copies sold, it's clear that Bach's influence is less a nod to the past and more a timeless hook. Beyond the technical wizardry and the jazz improvisations, there's an emotional core to Bach's music that speaks to the human condition. His compositions carry a weight and depth that resonate with listeners from all walks of life. It's like that movie everyone loves because it speaks to universal truths, except Bach does it with a harpsichord and some well-placed trills. His music has been used in everything from weddings to funerals to film scores, adding a touch of the sublime to the mundane. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The myth of Bach, as some kind of mystical genius who transcended his time, is both romantic and misleading. His enduring appeal is as much a product of historical happenstance as it is of his genius. Remember, Bach lived in a time when music was commissioned for specific events and audiences. His genius lay in his ability to elevate these commissions into something timeless, transforming the ephemeral into the eternal. Economically, Bach's music has become a cash cow. During his lifetime, his income was modest, hovering around 80 to 100 florins for a year's work, a sum that barely covered the cost of living for his sizable family. Fast forward to today, and Bach's works are part of a multi-million-dollar industry. From sheet music sales to concert performances, the economic impact of Bach's music is a testament to its enduring value. It's as if Bach himself had a secret stock portfolio that matured centuries after his death. And let's not forget the cultural and political currents that have swept Bach's legacy along. In the 19th century, as nationalism surged across Europe, Bach was adopted as a symbol of German cultural identity. His music became a rallying point, a way to assert cultural superiority in a world that was rapidly globalizing. This wasn't just about music, it was about identity, about claiming a piece of the cultural pie in an increasingly competitive landscape. So, as we wrap up this musical journey, what can we learn from Bach's enduring legacy? Perhaps it's that true genius isn't recognized in its own time, but revealed through the lens of history. Or maybe it's that music, like any great art, has the power to transcend its origins and speak to the human soul across generations. Bach's story is a reminder that while trends come and go, true artistry remains, quietly waiting for the world to catch up. In the end, Bach's music is like an old friend, familiar yet always surprising, comforting yet challenging. It's a testament to the power of creativity and the enduring impact of one man's relentless pursuit of perfection. So the next time you hear a Bach fugue or a jazz riff inspired by his work, remember, you're not just listening to music. You're experiencing a slice of history, a piece of Bach's genius that continues to resonate with the world today. And who knows, maybe Bach is somewhere up there, nodding along, satisfied that his music still holds a place in the modern world's chaotic symphony. In the year 1137, a star was born in Tikrit, and no, I'm not talking about a celestial body, I'm talking about Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to his buddies and his enemies as Saladin. His birth in this small town, now in modern-day Iraq, didn't exactly cause a stir in the universe. Why would it? He was the son of a Kurdish mercenary, and his early years were as unremarkable as a camel in the desert. But hold on to your chainmail, because this young lad was destined to shake up the 12th century like a snow globe in the hands of a hyperactive child. Now, the 12th century was a time of chaos that makes today's political circus look like a Sunday picnic. The Crusades were in full swing, with Europeans gallivanting across the Middle East like they were on some misguided medieval gap year. And then there was Saladin, growing up in the shadows of this grand debacle. Europe was busy sending its best and brightest, and a fair share of its dimmest, to reclaim the Holy Land. Spoiler alert, this wasn't going to end well for them. Saladin's early life wasn't the stuff of legend, unless you consider being bounced around various cities, as his family followed his father's military career, particularly legendary. By 1169, Saladin found himself in Egypt, thanks to a little help from his uncle Shirkuh, who had just taken control of the place. Saladin's rise to power was less a meteoric ascent and more of a careful climb up a wobbly ladder. He became the vizier of Egypt after Shirkuh's sudden death due to a rather unfortunate case of overeating. Yes, you heard that right. Never underestimate the dangers of an all-you-can-eat buffet. Once he had his hands firmly on the reins of power, Saladin wasn't content with just Egypt. He had bigger fish to fry, and those fish were flopping around in the tumultuous waters of the Crusader states. By 1174, Saladin had expanded his reach to include Syria, and he wasn't stopping there. He was like the medieval version of a corporate raider, but instead of hostile takeovers, he used a mix of diplomacy, cunning, and occasional swordplay. As it turns out, this combination is surprisingly effective. But what really made Saladin a rock star of medieval warfare was his ability to unite the fractious Muslim world under his banner, a feat akin to herding particularly stubborn cats. He did this not by force alone, though he wasn't afraid to use it when necessary, but through a blend of charisma, religious fervor, and political savvy. He managed to get rival factions to play nice, at least for a while, and focus on their common enemy, the Crusaders. And let's talk about those Crusaders for a moment. They had a knack for underestimating Saladin, treating him like a minor annoyance rather than the strategic genius he was. Their bungled attempts to counter him were almost comical. Picture this: the European powers, with their knights in gleaming armor and grandiose plans, marching into the Middle East with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Unfortunately for them, Saladin was the bullfighter, and he knew how to turn their bluster into his advantage. Take the Battle of Hattin in 1187, for example. Saladin lured the Crusaders into a trap so perfect it was almost poetic. Under the blistering sun of a July day, the European knights found themselves without water, exhausted and surrounded by Saladin's forces. It was a catastrophe, with the Crusader army decimated and their prized relic, the True Cross, taken as a trophy. One can almost imagine Saladin shaking his head at the Crusaders' strategic blunders, like a teacher disappointed in his student's performance on a history exam. Saladin's ability to outmaneuver his opponents wasn't just about military might. It was about understanding the lay of the land, both literally and politically. He was the kind of strategist who knew that sometimes the best way to win a battle was to avoid it altogether, using diplomacy and alliances to achieve his aims. He was a master of the long game, playing chess while his opponents were still figuring out checkers. Of course, the legend of Saladin grew with each of his victories, and the Europeans' attempts to deal with him became increasingly desperate. The Third Crusade was practically a who's who of European royalty, including Richard the Lionheart himself, all aiming to take down this out-of-nowhere threat. But Saladin wasn't going to be intimidated by a bunch of kings with fancy titles. He was busy reshaping the map of the Middle East while they were still dusting off their crowns. As the 12th century marched on, Saladin's reputation spread far and wide, both as a fierce warrior and a chivalrous leader. The myths and legends surrounding him began to grow, painting him as a noble and honorable opponent, even in the eyes of his enemies. But behind the legend was a man who knew how to play the Game of Thrones long before George R.R.R. Martin ever put pen to paper. So there you have it, the early life and rise of Saladin, a man who came from humble beginnings to become one of history's most formidable leaders. He wasn't born into greatness, he forged it himself, one battle, one alliance, and one strategic masterstroke at a time. And as for those European powers, well, they were in for a rude awakening. Saladin was here to stay, and he was just getting started. As the dust of the 12th century settled, Saladin wasn't just here to stay, he was here to dominate. Let's dive into one of his crowning strategic moments, the Battle of Hattin in 1187, a showdown so pivotal it could make a Hollywood blockbuster blush. Saladin's genius didn't just lie in swinging swords and leading charges, it was in orchestrating chaos like a maestro conducting an orchestra of bewildered crusaders. First things first, let's talk about geography. The Crusaders were lured into the arid wilderness near the Horns of Hattin, a place about as friendly as a scorpion in your boot. Saladin, the sly chess master he was, knew that controlling the landscape was half the battle. He had his troops strategically positioned, denying the Crusaders access to precious water sources. Imagine being in the Crusader camp, it's July, the sun is beating down like a relentless drummer, and your canteen's as dry as medieval humour. Now, you might be asking, how did the Crusaders get themselves into such a pickle? Well, it wasn't entirely their fault. They were led by Guy of Lusignan, a man with the strategic acumen of a broken compass. Under his command, the Crusader army embarked on what they thought would be a quick jaunt to relieve the besieged city of Tiberias. Spoiler, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't relieving. Saladin's forces, meanwhile, were fresh as daisies and ready to pounce. Saladin's plan was as elegant as it was ruthless. He knew that the key to victory wasn't just about who had more swords, but who could endure the elements and outlast their opponent. In this case, it meant turning the Crusaders into a dehydrated mess, staggering through the dust like extras from a zombie film. Picture Saladin watching from a distance, perhaps with a faint smirk, as the Crusaders bumbled about, wondering why their map didn't mention the lack of drinkable water. The battle itself was less of a traditional clash and more of a methodical dismantling. Saladin's forces harassed the Crusaders with hit-and-run tactics, wearing them down like a boxer delivering body blows before the knockout punch. By the time the Crusaders reached the Horns of Hattin, they were exhausted, demoralized, and outnumbered. Saladin's troops encircled them, and the rest was history, or rather, a massacre. Here's the kicker. In the midst of this chaos, Saladin managed to capture the True Cross, a relic so sacred to the Crusaders it was like snatching the championship trophy mid-celebration. It was a psychological blow as much as a physical one, a reminder that Saladin wasn't just a military genius, but a master of psychological warfare too. This wasn't just about winning battles, it was about demoralizing his enemies and cementing his status as the dominant force in the region. Now, let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of Saladin's tactics. It's the kind of strategic brilliance that makes you wonder how modern generals, with all their satellites and smart bombs, still manage to walk into traps that are essentially medieval reruns. It's like watching a rerun of your favorite sitcom and still laughing at the same jokes, only these jokes involve fewer laugh tracks and more catastrophic blunders. In the aftermath of Hattin, Saladin's victory reverberated across the medieval world. The loss of the Crusader army and the True Cross was a humiliation that sent shockwaves through Europe, prompting a call for the Third Crusade. But in the Middle East, Saladin was on a roll. He wasn't just a military leader, he was a symbol of unity and resistance, a charismatic leader who could unite disparate factions under a common cause. For the Crusaders, Hattin was a hard lesson in the perils of underestimating your enemy. They had walked right into Saladin's trap, blinded by their own hubris and the mirage of an easy victory. It was a wake-up call that their adversary wasn't just a capable leader, but a master of strategy who could outthink and outmaneuver them at every turn. As Saladin consolidated his power, the legends and myths about him continued to grow. He became a figure of chivalry and honor, even in the eyes of his enemies. A medieval paradox, if ever there was one. But behind the romanticized tales was a man who understood the harsh realities of power and warfare, a leader who knew that the path to victory was often paved with cunning and patience rather than brute force. And so, as the 12th century marched on, Saladin's story was far from over. He had reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East, and his influence would continue to be felt for generations. The Crusaders were down but not out, and the stage was set for a new chapter in this epic saga of power, ambition, and the enduring allure of the Holy Land. Stay tuned, because the story of Saladin and the Crusades is a tapestry woven with intrigue, betrayal, and the kind of historical twists that could give any modern thriller a run for its money. As the saga unfolds, we'll see how Saladin's legacy continued to shape the course of history long after the dust of Hattin had settled. So, as we delve deeper into Saladin's saga, let's pivot from the battlefield to the boardroom, or whatever passed for one in the 12th century. Imagine Saladin not just as the warrior king, but as a savvy administrator with a knack for turning chaos into order, like a medieval Gordon Ramsay in a particularly unruly kitchen. Except, instead of yelling about undercooked risotto, Saladin was focused on maintaining a delicate balance of power and fairness across his expanding empire. Saladin's empire wasn't just a collection of conquered lands, it was a patchwork quilt of cultures, languages, and, most importantly, taxes. And if you thought tax season was a drag now, try keeping track of medieval ledgers. Saladin knew he had to keep his treasury in robust health, especially with the ever-looming costs of warfare. It's said that he once quipped, "A kingdom without a treasury is like a knight without a sword," or at least he might have if he was more into quippy one-liners. To finance his endeavours, Saladin implemented a tax system that would have made even the most hardened IRS agent nod in approval. He reformed agricultural taxes, ensuring that the farmers, the backbone of his economy, weren't taxed into oblivion. The idea was simple. Happy peasants meant a steady supply of grain, which meant a happy army. And let's be honest, an army marches on its stomach, not just its swords. Saladin also imposed a land tax known as kharaj, a system that asked landowners to contribute to the state's coffers based on their land's productivity. It was a smart move. The kind of policy that kept the wheels of his war machine well-oiled, even if it meant the occasional grumble from the taxed. But it wasn't just about squeezing coins from his subjects. Saladin was a master of economic pragmatism, understanding that too much pressure could lead to rebellion, and nobody wants a peasant uprising on their to-do list. So he balanced the scales with a reputation for fairness, justice, and occasional acts of generosity. In fact, His penchant for charitable acts is the stuff of legend. He was known to give alms and provide for the poor, even as he collected taxes with the efficiency of a medieval accountant. Now, let's talk about this reputation for fairness and justice. It's easy to romanticize Saladin as a paragon of virtue, but let's not forget that medieval justice was about as forgiving as a Game of Thrones plot. Saladin's brand of justice was direct and often brutal, yet tempered with mercy, a delicate dance that kept his subjects in line while maintaining his image as a benevolent ruler. For instance, he was known for his judiciary reforms, such as appointing judges who were both respected and feared, ensuring that law and order were more than just abstract concepts. He even took measures to curb corruption, which, let's be real, was as rampant then as it is now. And then there's his diplomatic finesse, a skill as valuable as any sword in his arsenal. Saladin didn't just rely on brute force, he knew the power of a well-timed alliance or a carefully worded letter. His diplomatic skills were legendary, like when he managed to negotiate truces with various Crusader states, buying himself time to regroup and strengthen his positions. It was like playing a game of chess where each piece had its own agenda, and his ability to navigate these treacherous waters was nothing short of genius. But perhaps one of Saladin's most impressive feats was his ability to maintain cohesion among the diverse factions within his empire. He was the ultimate mediator, bringing rival groups to the table and convincing them to put aside their differences for the greater good. It wasn't always easy. Imagine trying to get a room full of medieval warlords to agree on anything. But Saladin had a knack for finding common ground, whether through shared religious fervour or the promise of mutual benefit. Yet, for all his diplomatic and administrative prowess, Saladin understood the harsh realities of maintaining power. He knew that the costs of warfare weren't just financial, but human. The price of victory often meant lives lost, and Saladin wasn't blind to the toll this took on his people. Still, he pressed on, driven by a vision of a united Muslim world, a world where his legacy could endure long after he was gone. As we peel back the layers of Saladin's story, it's clear that the man behind the myth was a complex blend of warrior, statesman, and visionary. His ability to govern with fairness, while wielding power with an iron fist, was nothing short of remarkable. Yet, even as we marvel at his accomplishments, it's important to remember the economic and social forces at play, forces that shaped his reign and the world he sought to build. But we're not done yet. The story of Saladin continues, with more twists and turns than a medieval manuscript. As we move forward, we'll explore how his legacy continued to evolve, leaving an indelible mark on history and the hearts of those who followed him. So stay tuned, because this tale of ambition, strategy, and the quest for justice is far from over. As we delve deeper into Saladin's saga, we find ourselves staring into the glittering mirage of his legendary chivalry, a mirage that might have more to do with creative chroniclers than cold, hard facts. Oh, the tales they told! If you believed every word, you'd think Saladin was a medieval saint with a sword. But let's not kid ourselves, medieval warfare was about as saintly as a barroom brawl. First, let's address the myth of Saladin's impeccable chivalry, which seems to have more in common with fairy tales than reality. Sure, he was known for his kindness, like when he sent his personal physician to treat Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. But don't forget that this was the same era where politeness and power plays were bedfellows. Saladin's acts of mercy were as much about PR as they were about any genuine benevolence. The man was a master of optics before Instagram influencers ever existed. Take, for instance, the surrender of Jerusalem in 1187. After his victory at Hattin, Saladin besieged the city, which had been under Crusader control since 1099. Now, the romantic narrative goes that he spared the city's inhabitants out of sheer noble-heartedness. True, he didn't repeat the Crusaders' bloody conquest of the city, where they massacred thousands. Instead, he allowed the citizens to ransom themselves, if they could afford it, of course. Those who couldn't, well, let's just say medieval benevolence had its price. Saladin reportedly set the ransom at 10 dinars for men, 5 for women, and 1 for children. A hefty sum when you consider that the average labourer might earn a few dinars in a year. Generosity had its fiscal limits after all. Now, let's talk about the spin doctors, the medieval equivalents of today's PR teams. Both Muslim and Christian chroniclers had their agendas, and they spun Saladin's image like a top at a child's birthday party. Muslim writers like Bach ad-Din ibn Shaddad painted him as the paragon of Islamic virtues, a leader divinely appointed to reclaim Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Christian chroniclers, despite being on the losing side, often depicted him with grudging admiration. After all, nothing sells parchment books like a good villain with a touch of honor. But why the hero worship from both sides? Here's the scoop. Saladin was a convenient symbol. For Muslim chroniclers, he was the rallying point to unite the fractured Islamic world against the Crusaders. For Christians, his chivalry was a way to rationalize their defeats. Sure, we lost, they might say, but at least we lost to an honorable foe. It softened the blow, like saying you came in second place to a world champion. Yet, peel back the layers of legend, and the less glamorous realities of medieval warfare reveal themselves. Saladin was a man of his time, and his campaigns were as brutal as any in history. The logistics alone were a nightmare, feeding an army, securing supplies, maintaining discipline among troops who came from vastly different backgrounds. It was a feat of administration that makes modern supply chain management look like child's play. The harshness of medieval warfare is often glossed over in tales of gallant knights and noble deeds. But in truth, battles were dirty, bloody, and chaotic. Disease and starvation were as lethal as any sword. When Saladin's army marched, it wasn't just knights and foot soldiers, it was a cavalcade of humanity, complete with camp followers, traders, and the inevitable stragglers. Imagine coordinating this medieval circus through hostile territory. It's enough to make any modern military planner break out in a cold sweat. But here's the kicker. Amidst this chaos, Saladin managed to maintain a sense of order and purpose. He was a leader who understood that the strength of his army wasn't just in its numbers, but in its unity. He kept his men focused on the prize, a united Muslim front against the Crusaders. It was a strategy that required not just military acumen, but a deep understanding of human nature. Now, let's debunk another myth, the notion that Saladin was always the magnanimous victor. While he was undoubtedly capable of mercy, he wasn't above using ruthlessness when the situation demanded it. During the siege of Acre in 1189, for instance, he ordered the execution of prisoners when negotiations with the Crusaders broke down. It was a stark reminder that even the most chivalrous leaders could be as cold as the steel they wielded. Yet, for all his complexities, Saladin's image endures. Perhaps it's because he represents a paradox we all recognize, the idea that one can be both a warrior and a statesman, a conqueror and a unifier. His story is timeless because it speaks to our fascination with the duality of human nature, how one can inspire both fear and admiration, often at the same time. So, as we continue this journey through Saladin's life, remember that the man behind the legend was as multifaceted as the times he lived in. He was a leader who could command respect and loyalty even from those who opposed him. And while the myths may be alluring, the reality is far more intriguing. A tale of power, strategy, and the enduring human desire for greatness. Stick around, because Saladin's tale is far from over. There are more myths to unravel, more battles to fight, and more lessons to learn from a leader whose legacy continues to shape the world in ways that even he might not have imagined. As we continue this journey through Saladin's life, we find ourselves at the doorstep of his final chapter. Saladin, the man whose name was synonymous with the 12th century power plays, took his last breath on March 4, 1193, in the heart of Damascus. And what's the first thing that happened after? Well, the man's treasury was emptier than a knight's stomach after Lent. Despite having been a sultan with vast territories under his control, Saladin died with barely a dinar to his name. That's right, folks. The great warrior king, the unifier of the Muslim world, left behind only 47 dirhams and 1 gold dinar. Not exactly the kind of treasure trove you'd expect from someone who reshaped the Middle East. So, what gives? Saladin had a penchant for generosity that would make even the most philanthropic billionaire blush. He gave away most of his wealth to the poor, the needy, and in the pursuit of the very dream that consumed him, a united Islamic front. It's the kind of altruism that today's tax accountants would probably advise against. But in Saladin's world, magnanimity wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a tool of statecraft. By spreading his wealth, he bought loyalty and unity, a lesson in leadership that resonates to this day. With Saladin's passing, The immediate aftermath saw a scramble for power among his successors. His empire, held together by his charisma and sheer will, began to fragment like a medieval jigsaw puzzle, missing its corner pieces. Saladin's sons, each with their own ambitions, were left to bicker over the spoils, and the unity he had painstakingly forged started to unravel faster than a poorly knitted chainmail. It's a classic tale. One man's vision can unite an empire, but without him, it can crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. Yet Saladin's legacy wasn't confined to the squabbles of his heirs. His impact on East-West relations was profound and enduring. He was a figure of fascination and fear in Europe, where his name became synonymous with both the noble foe and the formidable adversary. In the medieval imagination, Saladin was the embodiment of the noble savage trope, a paradoxical figure who was both the enemy and the epitome of chivalry. It's a narrative that allowed the West to craft its own stories of heroism and villainy, with Saladin often cast as the honourable antagonist. But let's not be fooled by the romantic veneer. The reality of East-West relations was as messy as a medieval banquet. The Crusades, sparked by religious fervour and territorial ambition, left scars that would take centuries to heal. Saladin's victories were a blow to European pride, exposing the vulnerability of their military expeditions and the limits of their reach. Yet they also prompted a grudging respect, an acknowledgement that the Muslim world wasn't some monolithic other, but a formidable and sophisticated culture in its own right. Fast forward a few centuries, and Saladin's story has been romanticized to the nth degree. Modern retellings often paint him as a paragon of virtue, a leader who stood above the petty squabbles of his time. But let's keep our feet on the ground here. Saladin was a man flawed, strategic, and as capable of ruthlessness as any of his contemporaries. His legend is a testament to the power of narrative, how stories can elevate a historical figure to mythic proportions, glossing over the gritty realities in favour of a more palatable mythos. And what lessons can we draw from Saladin's life today? For starters, leadership isn't just about wielding power, it's about wielding influence. Saladin's ability to unite disparate factions, to coax loyalty from diverse groups, is a masterclass in diplomacy. He understood that power was transient, but a legacy built on respect and unity could endure. His story also reminds us that history is often written by the victors, or, in this case, by those who managed to control the narrative. Saladin's mythos was crafted as much by his admirers as by his enemies, each seeking to mould his image to suit their own ends. And let's not forget the allure of the underdog. Saladin's rise from the son of a Kurdish mercenary to the sultan who stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest of European kings is the kind of story that resonates with our innate love for the improbable triumph. It's a narrative as old as time, one that speaks to our belief in the possibility of greatness, no matter how humble the beginnings. Saladin's journey was one of ambition and resilience, a reminder that even in the most tumultuous times, a single individual can change the course of history. In the grand tapestry of history, Saladin's legacy is a complex weave of fact and fiction, a testament to the enduring power of myth-making. It's a story that continues to captivate, offering lessons in leadership, strategy, and the ever-present human desire to find meaning in the chaos of the past. So, as we close the book on Saladin's life, let's celebrate not just the man, but the story. A tale of ambition, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of an underdog who dared to dream big. You awaken in 11th century Lhasa, where the thin air is as crisp as the snow-capped peaks surrounding the valley. Your lungs expand, drawing in a breath that feels like it's travelled centuries to greet you. Welcome to a day in the life of a Tibetan Lama, where spirituality meets the mundane, and the ethereal hum of chanting monks is punctuated by the reality of clinking coins and clattering dishes. Let's kickstart your morning with a ritual that is far from the glamorous, Zen-like scenes often painted by modern romanticism. First up, the practicalities, breakfast. A simple meal might set you back a few sang, the currency of the time. We're talking barley porridge, not some lavish spread. Barley, by the way, isn't just a dietary staple, it's the backbone of your economic existence here. Tibetans have a love affair with tsampa, a roasted barley flour mixed with tea and yak butter. It's cheap, filling, and let's be honest, an acquired taste. If you're wondering, a cup of butter tea, salty, not sweet, would cost you a few more sang. Not exactly a Starbucks run, but it does the job. Now, about those morning rituals. Before you can even think about diving into deep meditation or philosophical discourses, there's work to be done. You'd be surprised to learn that life in a Tibetan monastery isn't just about sitting cross-legged in serene contemplation. It's like running a small city. Every monk has chores, from cleaning to cooking to maintaining the monastery's infrastructure. Ever wonder why those robes are so meticulously maintained? Well, that's down to you and the laundry duties. And contrary to popular belief, enlightenment doesn't exempt you from scrubbing floors. And let's talk about the economics of this spiritual haven. A monastery is a microcosm of the larger economic world, with its own source of income and expenses. Donations are crucial, but so are the goods produced by the monastery, like crafts or agricultural products. It's a delicate balance of sustenance and spirituality, where the ethereal and the earthly coexist. The romanticized view of a life free from worldly concerns? Not quite the reality when there's a budget to manage and mouths to feed. The political climate of the time adds another layer to your day. The 11th century is a period of rejuvenation for Tibetan Buddhism, with Atisha's arrival from India revitalizing the faith. His teachings are like the latest philosophical iOS update. Everyone wants it, everyone needs it. But with these spiritual advancements comes a need for economic support. The monasteries, while spiritual centers, are also political players, navigating alliances and rivalries with regional powers and local lords. A Lama in this period isn't just a spiritual leader, but also a diplomat and a manager, balancing spiritual duties with the pragmatic demands of survival. The morning progresses and the air buzzes with the sound of chanting. The deep, resonating tones of the monks reverberate through the monastery halls, a sonic tapestry woven with ancient mantras. These aren't just sounds, they're tools, instruments of meditation designed to focus the mind and elevate the spirit. But let's not kid ourselves. It's also a display of unity and discipline, a performance of devotion that strengthens the community's ties. And considering the strict hierarchical structure of the monastery, keeping everyone in harmony is as much about spiritual alignment as it is about maintaining order. As the sun climbs higher, casting its golden glow over the monastery's intricately carved roofs, you might pause to consider the juxtaposition of this spiritual life against the harsh realities of economic survival. The image of the serene, detached monk fades into a more complex picture. You are a part of a living, breathing community where every chant, every chore, and every transaction weaves into the larger tapestry of Tibetan monastic life. It's a world where enlightenment dances with pragmatism, and spiritual pursuit doesn't happen in a vacuum, but in the bustling, vibrant heart of 11th century Lhasa. Just as your mind wraps around the tapestry of monastic life, the allure of Lhasa's vibrant streets calls you like a siren song. It's time to step beyond the monastery walls and immerse yourself in the bustle of 11th century Lhasa, a city that's anything but the isolated Shangri-La of popular imagination. The streets are alive with the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the animated chatter of merchants haggling over wares. It's a symphony of commerce, and you're about to take a front row seat. Let's debunk a myth right off the bat. Tibet wasn't some hermit kingdom locked away from the world. Quite the opposite. Tibet, especially Lhasa, was a melting pot of cultures and a critical nexus on the Silk Road. Traders from India, China, Persia and beyond paraded their goods like it was a medieval fashion week. Silk, spices, medicinal herbs, you name it, they sold it. Now, before you think it's all glamorous, remember that travelling the Silk Road was no first-class cruise. It was a perilous journey, often as likely to end in a bandit raid as it was in a lucrative trade deal. The road to riches was paved with as much risk as reward. As you saunter through the market, notice the diversity in the air, not just in language but in commerce. The Tibetan currency, the sang, jingles in your pouch, ready to be exchanged for some exotic goods. A bolt of Chinese silk might set you back around 40 sang, a small fortune, but the allure of its shimmering threads can't be overstated. Meanwhile, a pouch of saffron from Persia could cost twice that, but promises to transform your otherwise humble fare into a royal feast. Politically, the 11th century is a chessboard, and Tibet is a key piece. Nestled between the colossal empires of China and India, Tibet is both a buffer and a bridge. Its strategic location gives it a seat at the big kids' table, whether it wants it or not. China, under the Song dynasty, and the Indian kingdoms, particularly the Pala Empire, are like two schoolyard bullies eyeing each other over lunch. Tibet's role? The crafty kid who knows how to play both sides to keep itself out of the fray. The influence of Atisha, the famed Indian monk, is palpable here too. His teachings are like the latest must-have gadget, spreading faster than gossip. Tibetan Buddhism is in a state of renaissance, absorbing Indian philosophies while adding its unique flair. This cross-pollination isn't just a spiritual revival, it's a cultural and intellectual revolution. Scholars and monks travel to and from the Indian subcontinent, making the journey across the treacherous Himalayas, driven by the thirst for knowledge and spiritual growth. But let's not romanticize too much. For every scholar seeking enlightenment, there's a trader eyeing profit margins. The market is a cutthroat arena. You've got to haggle like your lunch depends on it, because it does. The price of barley might fluctuate depending on the latest bandit raid or crop failure. It's economics, 101 in real time, and everyone's a student. As you weave through the crowd, take note of the architecture. The Potala Palace may not yet dominate the skyline, but the Jokang Temple does, its golden roof gleaming in the sun. This is the spiritual heart of Lhasa, drawing pilgrims like moths to a flame. For the devout, a pilgrimage to Lhasa isn't just a journey, it's a penance, a chance to earn merit in the eyes of the divine. Here's a nugget to chew on. The idea of an isolated Tibet is as fictional as a Hollywood blockbuster. The city is a bustling hub, a cultural crossroads where ideas, goods, and people intermingle freely. This is where East meets West, where the ancient world comes to barter, debate, and occasionally brawl. Lhasa is a testament to the enduring human spirit of curiosity and commerce, a place where the world comes to both lose and find itself. As midday approaches, the sun hangs high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the cobblestone streets. The air is thick with the scent of incense and yak butter, a sensory reminder of the marriage between the sacred and the profane. Your morning in Lhasa has been a whirlwind tour of trade routes and political manoeuvring, a vivid tableau of life in a city that defies the myths of isolation. The day is still young, and there's much more to explore in the winding alleys and bustling markets of this remarkable city, where the past and the present collide in a cacophony of colour and sound. As the midday sun blazes over Lhasa, casting shadows sharper than a Lama's wit, you find yourself drawn back to the heart of monastic life. Sure, the market's a thrill, a riot of sounds and scents. But the real action, the cerebral fireworks, happen inside the monastery's hallowed halls. It's time to trade the clamour of commerce for the quiet hum of scholarly pursuit. Let's peel back the layers of mystique surrounding Tibetan Lamas and their scholarly endeavours. Spoiler alert, it's less about levitating gurus and more about nose-to-the-scrolls academics. The curriculum here in Lhasa is a robust blend of Buddhist philosophy, logic, and the sciences. We're talking about a syllabus that could put a modern liberal arts college to shame. No easy A's here, my friend. Among the keystones of this education is the study of Buddhist philosophy, an intricate web of thoughts that requires more brain power than a chess grandmaster's strategy. You delve into the teachings of Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Indian philosopher extraordinaire, whose works on the Madhyamaka school of thought are like the TED Talks of their time, mind-bending, provocative, and not without controversy. Imagine trying to wrap your head around the concept of sunyata, or emptiness, while the only caffeine available is a salty cup of butter tea. Good luck with that. But it's not all abstract pondering and spiritual wordplay. These lamas are also knee-deep in the sciences, and I don't mean just aligning chakras or reading auras. We're talking astronomy and medicine, subjects as practical as a yak in winter. Tibetan astronomy is a blend of Indian and Chinese influences, with the monks charting the stars using methods that would impress even a modern-day astrophysicist. And let's not forget Tibetan medicine, which combines herbal remedies and spiritual healing. Think of it as the original holistic health approach, minus the yoga pants. Now, let's talk manuscripts. Acquiring these precious scrolls is no walk in the park. It's more like a trek across the Himalayas, both literally and figuratively. We're in the pre-Gutenberg era, so each manuscript is painstakingly hand-copied by scribes. A single manuscript could set a monastery back several hundred sang, not exactly pocket change. The cost reflects not just the labour involved, but also the perilous journey these texts often make across mountain passes, dodging avalanches and bandits as they travel from India or China. The real kicker? These manuscripts aren't just for show. They form the backbone of Tibetan Buddhist education, a tangible testament to the monks' commitment to scholarship. This isn't Hogwarts with its magic books and enchanted quills. Every page is a product of sweat, devotion, and a bit of economic savvy. The monks must navigate a network of patrons and donors willing to fund this intellectual adventure, and here's where we bust another myth wide open. The image of the Lama as an ethereal figure, floating on a cloud of esoteric knowledge, is only half the story. Beneath those serene exteriors are scholars as rigorous as any found in the halls of Oxford or Nalanda. Tibetan Buddhism is built on a foundation of debate and dialectic, a kind of philosophical cage match where ideas are thrashed out in spirited argument. Picture a room full of robed scholars, passionately debating the nature of reality with an intensity that could give modern political pundits a run for their ratings. The debate sessions, known as debates on emptiness, are as lively as a tavern brawl and just as intellectually bruising. Monks challenge each other's understandings, defending doctrines with logic and wit. It's less about winning and more about refining one's grasp of complex philosophical concepts. The stakes? Only your spiritual development and, who knows, the trajectory of your next reincarnation. Now, why does all this matter? Because it paints a picture of Tibetan monastic life that is far removed from the romanticized, otherworldly image often propagated in popular culture. This isn't a world of mystical shortcuts to enlightenment, but one of hard graft, intellectual rigor, and community support. The Lamas are not just spiritual guides, but scholars, scientists, and teachers who dedicate their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting an amber glow over the monastery, you can't help but marvel at the irony. Here, in what many outsiders view as one of the most remote places on earth, exists a vibrant intellectual community that rivals any of its contemporaries. It's a testament to the enduring human spirit, the quest for knowledge, understanding, and truth. And as you consider the path ahead, you realize that the day is far from over. There are still more layers to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more stories to tell in the winding corridors of 11th century Lhasa, where the past whispers through the pages of ancient manuscripts and the debates of passionate monks. As you linger in the monastery's ancient halls, the sun's descent signals a shift in the day's rhythm. Your scholarly pursuits have wrapped up, but the afternoon holds new roles for you as a Lama. It's time to pivot from academic debates to the more hands-on aspects of your position, like resolving disputes and orchestrating ceremonies, tasks that reveal the monastery's muscle in the socio-political landscape of Lhasa. First up, adjudicating disputes. Now, if you thought monks lived in serene harmony, think again. The monastery doubles as a court, with Lamas like yourself acting as judges in everything from land squabbles to accusations of yak theft. Picture Judge Judy in a robe, minus the television cameras, but with a lot more incense. This role isn't just ceremonial, it's a cornerstone of the monastery's influence in the community. To get a sense of the stakes, consider this. Land ownership in 11th century Tibet is as convoluted as a soap opera plot, with overlapping claims and scant written records. A typical case might involve a farmer and a merchant, each waving their version of a land deed more passionately than a New Yorker gesturing during a heated debate. Your job? To divine the truth from this tangle, using a mix of Buddhist principles, local laws, and a healthy dose of common sense. The catch? There's no CSI team or DNA test to fall back on, just your wits and wisdom. But why, you ask, do monks get to play Solomon? It's all about trust. In a world where secular authority is often as reliable as a medieval weather forecast, religious figures are seen as neutral arbiters. Besides, the monastery's wealth and influence mean that its edicts carry weight. And let's not forget the economic incentives. Resolving disputes keeps the wheels of commerce greased, ensuring a steady flow of donations and offerings to the monastery. Every case you settle not only maintains peace, but also secures the institution's coffers. It's a delicate balance of power and piety where your decisions echo far beyond the monastery walls. Yet, not all your afternoons are spent refereeing legal bouts. Ceremonial duties beckon, and these are as much about spectacle as they are about spirituality. Think of the grand religious ceremonies as the original blockbuster events, drawing crowds from miles around. They're not just spiritual gatherings, they're social and economic affairs, the medieval equivalent of a Hollywood premiere. Let's say you're presiding over a major festival, Vesak, for example, which commemorates the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and death. The monastery is buzzing with activity, like ants on a dropped ice cream cone. Pilgrims flood in, their numbers rivaling a packed sports arena. Locals and visitors alike offer gifts ranging from food to precious metals, hoping to curry favour with the divine. These gatherings are cash cows, swelling the monastery's wealth faster than you can say, Om Mani Padme Hum. And then there's the ritual itself, a theatrical blend of chanting, incense, and intricate dances. It's as much a test of endurance as it is of devotion. The ceremonies can stretch on for hours, sometimes days, and require the stamina of a marathon runner and the grace of a ballet dancer. Here's where another myth bites the dust, the notion of the sombre, silent monk. In reality, these events are vibrant, colourful, and downright noisy, a sensory overload that would make even the most seasoned festival-goer feel at home. But don't be fooled, these celebrations are more than just a good time. They reinforce the monastery's role as a spiritual and cultural hub, a place where the community gathers to reaffirm its values and identity. They also underscore the monastery's economic clout. Every offering strengthens its standing, both materially and in the hearts of the people. It's a savvy blend of faith and finance, where the divine meets the pragmatic in a dance as intricate as any performed during the ceremony. The political dimensions of these roles can't be overstated. Monasteries in 11th century Tibet are powerhouses, wielding influence that rivals secular rulers. The Lamas aren't just spiritual leaders, they're political players, brokers of alliances, and custodians of knowledge. Their decisions can sway local politics, mediate between feuding factions, and even affect regional diplomacy. Picture a Vatican City with yaks instead of Swiss guards, and you're on the right track. This power isn't just handed over on a silver platter. The monasteries worked for it, fostering relationships with local elites and regional powers. They offer spiritual legitimacy in exchange for protection and resources, a quid pro quo that ensures their survival in a world as volatile as a stock market on caffeine. The relationship is symbiotic, each side giving just enough to keep the other invested. As the afternoon wanes and the shadows grow long, you're left with the unmistakable understanding that being a Lama is as much about navigating the earthly realm as it is about seeking spiritual enlightenment. It's a role that requires diplomacy, wisdom, and a dash of showmanship. You're not just a monk in a monastery, you're a key player in a complex socio-political game where the stakes are as high as the Himalayas. The sun dips below the horizon, casting a golden hue over Lhasa's sprawl. The day's duties might be winding down, but the realization dawns that the monastery's influence is far-reaching, woven into the very fabric of Tibetan life. It's a multifaceted role, blending spiritual leadership with economic savvy and political acumen. You've got one foot in the sacred and the other firmly planted in the secular, balancing both worlds with the finesse of a tightrope walker. As darkness settles in, the monastery's bells toll the end of another day. Yet, the rhythm of monastic life never truly stops. With each ring, you hear echoes of the past and whispers of the future, reminding you that in 11th century Lhasa, the journey toward enlightenment is as much about navigating the complexities of human existence as it is about transcending them. And tomorrow, as the sun rises once more over the snow-capped peaks, there will be new challenges, new disputes to settle, and new ceremonies to orchestrate, each a testament to the enduring interplay of power and faith in this extraordinary tapestry of life. As the bell's resonant chimes fade into the evening air, a silence settles over the monastery, thick with the day's accumulated wisdom. It's in this quiet moment, when the shadows stretch like the long arms of history, that you can finally take stock of what it means to be a Lama in 11th century Lhasa. Sure, you've navigated scholarly debates that would make Socrates scratch his head and mediated disputes with the finesse of the medieval diplomat, but there's more on this plate than just spiritual enlightenment and yak butter. Let's debunk the last straggling myth, the romantic image of the Lama as a hermit philosopher, divorced from worldly concerns. The reality is a bit more, shall we say, involved. Picture a CEO of a multinational company, Only swap out the board meetings for meditation sessions and the profit margins for spiritual merit. You're not just a guardian of the soul, but also a custodian of community cohesion and, let's be honest, the monastery's coffers. Economically speaking, you're the linchpin in a system that rivals any Wall Street operation. The monastery is less a secluded retreat and more a bustling hub of commerce and community. It's a microeconomy with its own supply chain, agricultural production, artisanal crafts, and a steady stream of donations. Each coin, each grain of barley, is a thread in the tapestry of survival that you and your fellow monks are constantly weaving. The monastery's economic health isn't just about keeping the lights on, it's about maintaining its status as a beacon of spiritual and temporal power. Politically, you're a player in a high-stakes Game of Thrones, minus the dragons but with plenty of fire. Your role as a Lama places you at the crossroads of influence and diplomacy. In the grand chessboard of Asian geopolitics, Tibet is the vital rook, strategically placed between the powerhouses of China and India. It's a position precarious enough to make even the steadiest hand tremble. The monasteries act as both buffer and bridge, negotiating alliances and maintaining delicate relations with regional lords and foreign emissaries. Your decisions are like pebbles dropped in a pond, ripples spreading far beyond your immediate sight, but impacting the entire socio-political landscape. Culturally, the monastery is the beating heart of Lhasa, an intellectual and spiritual powerhouse. It's a place where philosophy isn't just pondered but lived, debated, and refined. The teachings of luminaries like Atisha infuse the air, their ideas taking root and growing into the complex garden of Tibetan Buddhism. And yet, the Lamas' cultural influence extends beyond scholarly pursuits. You're a cultural custodian, preserving traditions while also being a conduit for new ideas flowing in from the Silk Road, which is more like a superhighway of cultural exchange than the isolated path it's often portrayed as. For those of you keeping score, you've just spent a day in the life of a Lama, and it's clear that the role is as multifaceted as a yak's stomach. Yes, there's the appeal of the serene, meditative life, a romantic notion that draws many to the idea of monasticism. However, the reality is a juggling act of spiritual guidance, economic management, and political strategy. It's a role that demands adaptability, wisdom, and yes, a touch of showmanship. The picture we paint of 11th century Lhasa is a far cry from the oversimplified narratives that often dominate popular imagination. This isn't just a spiritual Shangri-La, untouched by the concerns of the mortal world. It's a complex society, woven together by threads of trade, politics, and religion. A tapestry as rich and intricate as the brocades traded in its bustling markets. The legacy of this period is one of resilience and adaptation, a lesson in how societies can thrive amidst the challenges of their time. As you reflect on these insights, consider the enduring human quest for balance between the spiritual and the temporal, the individual and the community, the local and the global. This is the legacy of the Tibetan Lamas, a testament to their ability to walk the tightrope of history with both grace and grit. So, as you drift into sleep, let the hum of the monastery's evening chants be your lullaby, a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, the human spirit remains a vibrant, dynamic force. In the grand tapestry of history, each thread counts, each story matters, and every day is a new opportunity to weave something beautiful out of the complex, chaotic, and often contradictory strands of life. As the night deepens, know that you've glimpsed a world both familiar and foreign, where the past echoes into the present, offering lessons and legacies that continue to shape us today.